Hi, Misha here, and this is a video I've wanted to do for a very long time, especially this year, because the year 2023 marks the 80th anniversary of the first flights of the first jet, really the only operational Allied jet fighter in World War II, from Britain, from the RAF. But I knew it would be a huge project video. But I just finally did it. And after a while, I will do another video like this on the Royal Navy. But I'm gonna need a rest after doing this one. I thought about breaking this up into like fighter interceptors and fighter bombers, ground attack, but in the end, so many British aircraft started off as one and kind of transformed into the other and became multi-role. So yeah, we're going to look at pretty much all the mainline British Royal Air Force jets from the beginning to present day. And we're just talking about fighters. We're not doing bombers. This is already going to be big enough. These are all 1/72 scale diecast. Most are either Corgi or Hobbymaster, but there are a few oddballs thrown in, like Woody Wings and Aviation 72, because that's the only way to get them. And we'll have much the same story when we do the Royal Navy. But with no further ado, unless you want to go over and help support on Patreon, if you could at least like, share, and subscribe, because this is going to be an all-day project for me to do this video. So, with that said, let's go all the way back, even before the Second World War, and talk about the very earliest days of the jet engine and Sir Whittle. Very much beginning at the beginning. Let's see how long this video takes. Anyway, the Gloucester Meteor, and this is the original, the F-1, the Fighter Mark I. When people think of jets in World War II, they think of the Messerschmitt Me-262. Rightfully so, it's quite important to history. But Britain was right there with the Germans in jet technology, and in some ways made a better aircraft. Other ways the Germans trumped them. Either way, work predates the war in both cases. Going back to 1936, Sir Frank Whittle first proposed a jet engine. He would start a company to kind of produce the design, and then in 1939 he made a trip to Gloucester, and he found kindred souls there, so they agreed to work together that summer, so just a couple months before the war. They also met Lord Tizard, Sir Tizard, who would be important for the pushing forward of the jet within England, not just with Gloucester, but other companies we'll talk about. So in 1940, the Air Ministry requested a prototype, and they needed it to be an interceptor. At the very beginning, before the fall of France, it had a modest priority. But after France fell, the UK decided it really needed a fast interceptor to challenge German bombers, which, after France, were going to be striking the UK more and more. So that was the initial idea. It was to be a bomber interceptor. So that's kind of what they worked on. The first engine was the W1, the Whittle 1, and actually the first prototype flew in May of 1941, but it was just a proof of concept. It was actually slower than a piston, a propeller aircraft. One engine only. It wasn't meant to do anything except, prove it would work. They were going to do a better engine, more powerful engine, the W2. And in 1942 they worked on this, but they had delays and problems. So the only thing that really happened that year were some taxi tests and kind of ground tests for the aircraft. Meanwhile, there was a rival over at de Havilland, the H1 engine. And it actually would be with this engine that the Gloucester Meteor would first fly the prototype in March of 1943. So it was fitted with the competitors' engines. But it wouldn't be long before the W-2 was finally worked out, and it would fly in June of that year, 1943. And from that point, they would make additional prototypes. 8 had originally been ordered. And by January of 1944, the kinks had been worked out, and essentially going from the prototype to the production model, the F-1, did not entail much more than giving it armament and a few other minor tweaks to get it going. And from there, the next step would be testing it over in North America against the US's XP-59. If you've never heard of that jet, that's a reason it never really went anywhere. And the British design proved much more successful. Therefore, in June, the Royal Air Force, the RAF, started to receive F-1s, started to train up, and then it was declared ready for combat operations on July 17th. And on the 27th, it was sent out on its first mission, essentially to reconnaissance and shoot down V-1 buzz bombs. And it would have its first victories at the beginning of August of that year, again shooting them down. It was armed with 4 20mm cannons, so pretty hard hitting, certainly better than a 303 or a 50 cal even. But that was initially it. And they were already working on the F-3. They didn't make many F-1s. This one here from Corgi is important because it is from the first run, but they only made about 20, so enough for one full squadron. The F-3 would be created that August, flying that September, and delivered beginning in December of 1944. And it was just an improved version. It corrected a couple of issues with the cannon, gave a new sliding canopy. They would lengthen the engine nacelles a bit, a few other little tweaks and changes, and they would actually build nearly 250 of those. And it was the wartime version. They weren't cleared to operate in Europe yet. They didn't want these crashing and the Germans getting their hands on them. Makes sense. But they did use them in war games that fall against bombers, mainly the B-24, to emulate the Messerschmitt 262 so they could develop new tactics in the bomber groups to defend themselves as best they could against the German jet. So that was actually quite important. They would end up shooting down about 18 V-1 buzz bombs. Then they would finally get transferred to Europe in January of 1945, so after the Battle of the Bulge, and they would operate out of Belgium. They're still not cleared to fly into Germany, but they operated as a day fighter, even reconnaissance aircraft, and would have multiple operations. In March, they were finally cleared to operate in Germany, and then in April, there would be the first losses, but it wouldn't be to enemy fire. It would actually be 2 meteors colliding in the air. So, just an accident, but still tragic enough. By that point, though, the war is all but over, and it did have a kill record. Although it never really went up against the Messerschmitt 262 in combat, it did claim about 4 dozen German aircraft, although many of them were still on the ground. Some of them were in the air, of course, older propellers. So it was the preeminent fighter, if still in relatively small numbers, by May of 1945. And it was the only Allied operational jet in the war, at least in terms of fighter. You could argue the P-80, just tail end, and it was a reconnaissance aircraft only at that point, so it's about as good as it got. But they knew they could do better. They were already working on the F-4, and this would have the first major updates. It would have a strengthened undercarriage. They would uprate the engines and allow it to carry fuel tanks under the wings, several little tweaks and things. and that would appear late that year and be in RAF service by 1946. It actually would be a success. They would build a large number of those as well, but at least 150 for export. It was the first export version, which meant the RAF didn't get many and didn't get them very fast because post-war, economy mattered again. So a lot of the F4s would go to various militaries besides the RAF. It would also lead to the first commercially owned, privately owned jet in the world. So the next step would be the F8. This is an older Corgi, when they were still doing them with the gear down. I've got one that has gear up that's actually an F8. This is an FR9. Just decided to grab it because they're virtually the same and it was easier to hand, and I wanted to show you one with the gear down anyway. So the F8 was the next big step forward in 1948. The prototype was actually a modified F4, then they would make a true new production model later that year. The F4 had already featured clipped wings. They would further refine that. They would also extend the fuselage by 2.5 feet. And after the initial prototypes, they would go to a new tail to kind of act better with the new aerodynamics. It still has the reinforced frame and everything. This was also the first model, the F8, to feature a ejection seat. That's kind of important. Still armed with 4 20mm cannon, but again we have provisions for tanks on the wings here for extended range. The FR9 was a armed fighter reconnaissance version introduced in 1950, give or take. The FR8, FR9 could both carry either 16 small rockets, of course unguided, or 8 larger rockets unguided under the wings, again on the outboard. Or they could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs. So they had further uprated engines, kind of pushing the design as far as it could go. And it was also commercially successful, both within the RAF. It was their primary fighter and reconnaissance aircraft from 1950 to 1955. The Australians flew them. That's important because they used them in Korean War. But, it is an aging design. And by 1956, they knew it, and it was, scheduled for replacement. But not a bad life for what this is. So what are this plane's specs? Overall length is about 45 feet. Wingspan of about 37 feet. Of course, it has a crew of 1. There was the T7, the trainer Mark 7, that was a 2-seater. But actually, that did not come along until 1949, so they waited several years to make a trainer. Makes sense. Like I said, the engines have been upgraded several times, but even in the end, its top speed wasn't much more than about 600 miles per hour, or about Mach 0.8, so definitely subsonic. The engines were a mixed bag. They were more reliable than the Messerschmitt, and the way that they were housed and the wing and everything was a better design. So the whole thing behind the Meteor was it was meant to be built modular, so different factories. And again, kind of the idea about bombing. So it was easier to work on than the Messerschmitt. One reason they went with the Whittle engine is it had a longer service life than the H1 engine, and definitely did then compared to the Messerschmitt. Now part of that for the Messerschmitt could just be, the stresses of end of the war. Quality goes down, of course, but it's also the metallurgy, the temperatures. The Messerschmitt engine was just prone to some things, and the Whittle design was just more robust there, and it was also easier to work on. Maximum altitude, was about 42,000 feet, 43 maybe. So wasn't the super duper best performing, but right after World War II, It was really the best performing production military fighter aircraft in the world. For a brief time, it held records. And as you can see here at the reconnaissance version, it was fitted into several worlds. There was even a night fighter version, the Mark 11, and several export versions as well. They would build about 3,950 of these, from the original prototypes all the way through the F-8s and F-9s in the Korean period. So quite an extensive production run. Nothing like the Sabre or the MiG-15, but, you know, hey, why not? It was a good first effort, it really was. What held it back, though, the wings. They're straight. They didn't do the swept wing. Of course, they didn't know to. Now, the Messerschmitt did have a swept wing, but it was done by accident. They had their reasons for doing it, but it wasn't for speed or performance. They just happened to stumble upon its effectiveness. And of course, over time during services, we get better things. Like I said, ejection seat, better cockpit layout, better communications. But it was still a World War II technology aircraft, so, you know, there's only so much you can do with that. And even though it kind of won the race to become Britain's first jet, there was a competitor right on its heels that is often overlooked, but actually is quite important, and also quite cool looking. We come to the RAF's second operational jet fighter, de Havilland's Vampire. This has a very interesting story, and it's something that you'll see the British do quite a few times. Have a plan and a backup plan, and in something like the case of the V-Bomber series in the Cold War, 3 plans in total. The Gloucester Meteor was the plan. That's what they were going with. That received the most attention. However, in 1941, Lord Tizard suggested to de Havilland that they might work on a jet fighter themselves, a jet interceptor. Again, the need was so great. What if the Meteor fails? After all, the W2 engine was giving troubles. So building off Whittle's work, that's where that H1 engine that was trialed out, and the Meteor, I think it was the Meteor F2 that had the trials engine, but never went anywhere. Anyway, so they started a project. And they actually wanted to do more of a bomber, kind of to replace their existing Mosquito, long-range, high-performance bomber. But no, the Air Ministry said, no, we need a fighter, we need an interceptor. So that's what they went with. The original version was known as the DH-99 internally. This would evolve into the DH-100. Originally, it was to be an all-metal aircraft. The Air Ministry suggested, like with a Mosquito, do a mix of metal and wood. That was to save on weight, because what de Havilland was proposing, the Air Ministry didn't have a lot of faith in. They wanted to do a single engine. The Meteor and the Messerschmitt, for that matter, were twin engine designs. When they did try out a single engine prototype in 1941, it didn't do well at Gloucester, so, it was proof of concept. But no, de Havilland went ahead with it. They wanted to do that. And that's where you get this very interesting look layout. Now, funnily enough, in 1942, kind of seeing the war changing, the Air Ministry said, hey, how about that bomber idea? And de Havilland said, no, we're doing a fighter. So, yeah, I found that kind of funny. Regardless, they started working on their first prototype, and it would fly in September of 1943. So not long after Gloucester, not really. And it did quite well. That would lead to 1944. The first kind of production model, the Mark I, was ready to go. And, at least the design was ready by May, June. And the Air Ministry agreed to go ahead and order it. Originally it was just kind of the backup plan. There were no plans to really do it. It was just more of an experiment. In fact, for a long time, it was just a de Havilland internal project. but they said they would buy between 100 and 300. Now, they had already ordered 300 Meteors, which, were about to go into full rate production. So de Havilland would tool up, although since they were busy, a lot of the production would be handled by English Electric. And because of various reasons, there were only 6 production models ready by war's end, so obviously it didn't go into service. It was flown, shown to the public in May to celebrate the VE Day, and it would go into RAF service, that's for sure. And it would lead to some interesting tests and trials. In 1945, full rate would begin, and ultimately they would get about 240 of the original Mark I. That would lead to the improved F3 design, which they would build about 200 of, and ultimately we would get the FB Mark V, FB5, which was kind of the fighter bomber variant, and then the tropical variant, the FB6, so on and so forth. And these would start appearing in 1948, 1949, about the same time as the Meteor. So why this aircraft? Why is it maybe better or not as good as the Meteor? And also, why did the Vampire, as it became known, not really get the midlife update? The Meteor went from F1, F3 with the F4's transitional to the F8, F9 standard. Yeah, there was the FB5, FB6, but they weren't major updates. They would have the Mark II and Mark III Goblin engines improved. They would strengthen the airframe a bit. But overall, the plane really didn't receive a lot of attention over time. So, single engine. This is a lighter, smaller aircraft compared with the Meteor, especially the later Meteors. It's about 32 feet long with about a 38-foot wingspan. Top speed, though, was not quite 550 miles per hour. So slower. Max altitude, about the same as the Meteor, 42,000 up to 43,000 feet, light loaded. Guns, the same, 420mm Hispano cannon, 150 rounds each, so again, very much like the Meteor. It could only carry 2 500-pound bombs versus 2 1,000 on the Meteor, or it could carry 8 smaller rockets or 2 smaller drop tanks. So it sounds maybe not as good, and in some ways it wasn't, but in other ways it was better. Having one engine made it lighter, made it easier to maintain, made it cheaper to produce. It also made it less fuel intensive. It had roughly twice the range of the Meteor. In fact, it wasn't a Meteor, it was a de Havilland Vampire that made the first transatlantic crossing of a jet, setting a record. Also, its lighter weight, smaller size made it quite attractive to the Royal Navy. A Vampire was the first jet to successfully land on a naval carrier, in fact. And that promising start would lead to the Sea Vampire, the Navy's first operational jet. But that's a story for the follow-up video, where we'll deal with the Royal Navy. As for the Air Force, they would deploy these more in Africa than, say, Korea. And that's why there was a tropicalized version. And they ultimately would be deployed as a fighter bomber. And they would also be exported to over 30 nations. A long time ago I did a video on the Swedish Vampire variant, which I do have a model of. Maybe one day I'll revisit Sweden. They were also licensed, produced in France. In fact, most Allied nations would use them. The only ones that really didn't were the US, West Germany, Belgium, and I believe there was the Netherlands or Denmark didn't use them, but everyone else pretty much did. Spain, I don't think Spain used them. Either way, most nations at least had some, and they did make quite a few, over 3,200, with production running up to about 1953, give or take. And it would have one other kind of claim to fame. Now, we're not doing trainers in this video. We're just doing fighters, fighter bombers. But I had to bring out the TF-10, or excuse me, the TF-11, because of the NF-10, the night fighter. Yeah, in 1950-51, they introduced a two-seat version with a cockpit kind of inspired by the Mosquito, side by side, and enough room for a radar, at least in certain versions. Now, this would operate in the RAF as a night fighter for a few years, about 50 to 55, supplementing the Meteor night fighter, and in some ways it was better. Again, 2 people versus 1, more room for radar, still single engine though. And they would also use these as day fighters. It wouldn't last long though, because new technology would come along, so yeah, limited. But it's important, and once they were done using these as night fighters, they would convert many to trainers, including exporting, and they would make over 700 two-seat vampires. So I did want to mention it because of its impact on the night fighting community. Of course, at this time, we don't have any kind of guided weapons. It's just rockets and what have you. But it's cool, nonetheless, I do believe. Neat little model, I think. Again, still from Corgi. For the first part of this video, we're mostly going to be looking at Corgis. So yeah, we see kind of a division in the RAF with day and night. And a lot of aircraft, as they kind of age out, like the Meteor, will turn from fighter interceptors to fighter bombers, like in Korea. We see that with the American F-84, for that matter. And it would happen. The Meteor did well, but it definitely could not hold its own with, say, the MiG-15. That's just fact. But the F-86 could. We actually moved a stand-in here. I put a F-86E on, North American Sabre. It'll have to do, because this was kind of Britain's next day fighter, temporarily at least, because of the Korean War, and also because of labor government politics. Post-World War II, the military suffered several cutbacks. Now, you can't really blame them. They were rebuilding the United Kingdom after a devastating war, and they felt like they had enough hardware, and yeah, so different governments, everything else. This is why the Meteor really stayed in service as long as it did, amongst other many things. Of course, the Korean War kind of came out of nowhere and took a lot of people unaware, and they needed fighters. So in kind of a mutual aid program, Canada steps in. Now, in 1948, Canadair, Avro, would start making the Canada Sabre, and I do have a model of it, but it's the later Mark VI, which wouldn't really be appropriate for the British, even though the Mark VI is a stellar Sabre variant. But no, Avro in Canada would make the Sabre under license from North America, making over 1,800, and it would serve Canada and many other militaries besides. And their first ones were essentially the F-16, yeah, the F-86E. And Britain would get a couple of the Mark IIs just for testing and trials, but pretty much all of the Mark IVs, the program was internally known as the CL-13 for what it's worth. Pretty much all of the Mark IVs were destined for the RAF. They would build nearly 430, and initially Canada would keep 70 back for itself, but these would be given to the RAF eventually, meaning that the RAF flew just over 130 total and equipped a dozen squadrons. And most of them operated the Sabre from 53 or 54 up through 1956. So it covered the gap. Remember, they didn't know how long the Korean War would go on. So Yeah, this was their next fighter, and it was an improvement over what they had, especially considering it was pretty much being funded by the U.S. The Sabre is nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Meteor, 150 more than the Vampire, and nearly 700. Still subsonic, but, Mach 0.9. It has a much higher max altitude of about 54,000 feet. And, of course, it's swept wing. It's one engine. It actually has better range not only than the Meteor, but also the Vampire, at least with tanks. And it has 4 hard points under the wings instead of just 2. And it can carry quite a bit more payload, about 3,000 pounds, 3,500 in some cases. So, twice the Meteors and about 4 times the Vampires. And a wider range of iron bombs, rocket pods. And it's armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns. Maybe not quite as good as 20 mil cannon, but a lot more rounds, about 1,600 rounds total on board. And just generally was a more modern aircraft with just better handling, better performance. And even though the Mark IV from Canada was essentially an F-86E, they did make a few minor improvements. So that's what Britain flew. They designated this as the F4. And after they were done with them in 56, they would refurbish about 300 in the UK and ship them back to the USA, because they were basically Lend-Lease, the Cold War equivalent. And so they were only in service as the RAF's day fighter for a brief time, but it let them fill that gap. They really didn't have many new airplane projects, and that gave them those necessary couple of years to get the projects that had been on the drawing board for a while up and running. So now we return, by the way, this is a Hobby Master. Now we return to Corgi and homegrown Brit designs. The Hawker, later produced under the Hawker Siddeley name, Hunter. This was a day fighter / interceptor, later fighter bomber, and fighter reconnaissance aircraft. Like I said, after World War II, the Labour government really put a freeze on adoption of new aircraft. But they did allow for experiments, designs, prototypes, testing to happen. And this would actually result in a naval fighter that we will get to in that video, known as the P-1030 and 1040. And that was a pretty conventional straight wing design, and it had the dual exhausts, but using one engine. They would take that at Hawker and give it a 35-degree swept back wing. They would also go to a more modern single pipe exhaust with 2 intakes in the front. And this would have a few different project names, but ultimately would be the P-1067 around 1949-1950. About that time, Korean War, governments changed, times change, and now they need a new fighter interceptor, especially for bombers, that kind of thing. So Supermarine and Hawker are tasked with creating one. Now, Supermarine would have the Swift, but that project didn't have a whole lot of results. So it would be Hawker that would take the lead. And the first prototype would fly in July of 1951, which would directly lead to the F-1 fighter Mark I in 1952, which was adopted for service the summer of 1953, and the first squadrons would start to become active in 1954. And that's how we were able to replace the Sabre. And production would ramp up and run through the mid 50s and late 50s, with kind of the ultimate version, the F6, resulting in 1956 production time. So what are we here? How is this fighter? How does it compare to the Sabre and the previous Meteor? This is again from Corgi. It's an older one. You can tell by the stand. But it does have gear up and down. The original versions, for one thing, the Mark III was just a test bed. The Mark I, Mark II, the major difference was the engine type. The F1 used the Avion, I can't talk. Sorry about that. Been talking for a bit now. Used the Avon engine, and then they would be replaced by the Sapphire for the 2 because they were having trouble. And it would go back and forth. The F4 and F5 would be essentially the same aircraft, but with the 2 different engines. The F4 would introduce some changes, including a new leading edge for the wing, the so-called dog tooth. And they would rework the air brake, and they would start to give it wet wings. Typically, you'll just see 2 230-gallon tanks, but theoretically it can take 4, because early on, the Hunter here had very limited range, like under 400 miles. Yeah. So yeah, they would update that. The aircraft is, larger than what we've seen before. We're right at 45 feet long, give or take the exact variant. Wingspan of 33 to 34, again, give or take variant. It's a little faster than the Sabre. It can cross 700 miles per hour, about 710, 715. So it's capable of... Still, I guess you call it transonic. It's still technically subsonic in straight flight. I can get up to about Mach 0.93, 0.94. But in a dive, it can cross the sound barrier. And it has a pretty good maximum altitude of about 50,000, so higher than the Meteor and Vampire, but not quite as much as the Sabre. And its primary armament, because this was built as a bomber interceptor initially, and this was before guided weapons, were 4 30mm cannon. And still have 150 rounds each, so the same round count as the Meteor, Vampire, but larger bullet. And the way they did it was quite interesting. The guns are in a pack. They can be hoisted out on the ground and quickly changed out, giving it a quick reload. So the idea was it could land and top its guns off and get back in the air as quick as possible. And the first combat these would see would be in the Suez Canal crisis in Egypt in 1956. So that would have been the F4, F5 series. But the big one would be the F6. They'd build 100, 150 of each of the F4, F5s. But the F6 would take a big chunk of the production. So here is one. This is actually an FGA 9 that I wanted to show because it has some of the updates, including these blisters on the underside, which are actually to catch the spent cannon rounds, as opposed to this having flying out and bouncing off the aircraft. They also went to new fuel tanks. Typically, the inboard pylons would be taken up by the 2 fuel tanks. Again, theoretically could carry 4, but it almost always had at least 2 because of range. And by this point, they've got the engine stuff worked out, and it's a relatively solid, dependable aircraft. It would continue to serve as a fighter through the 50s and into the early 60s. Operating in Africa and elsewhere. But its time as a frontline fighter would be relatively short because now we're getting into the era of supersonics. So what the RAF did, they reworked a large number of the F6s into the FGA 9, or Fighter Ground Attack Mark 9, which we have here. Essentially, they strengthened the airframe Like I said, they added new different fuel tanks. We still have only 4 hard points under the wings, but it can carry over 7,000 pounds of payload. And still unguided iron bombs, rocket pods, that kind of thing. And it still has its cannon. And there was a reconnaissance variant, the FR-10, which had cameras and other things you'd expect. And those would be about the most advanced versions the RAF would fly. But other nations, they would build nearly 2,000 of these, and a big chunk would be for export. Sweden, Switzerland. Singapore got an interesting variant based on this that actually had 7 hard points instead of just 4, and it actually had AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, but the RAF version did not. It could even carry Maverick air-to-surface, anti-tank missiles. And there was a 2-seat trainer, the T-7, that in theory could be used for ground attack because it had 10 side-by-side seating, but in reality it was just used as a trainer. It actually would be that would serve for the longest time. In the RAF, this would serve in the close air support fighter bomber role from the mid-60s through the 70s, and then be retired in the 80s. By that point, its day was up. Ground munitions have been changing, and with only 4 attachment points, 2 of them usually taken up by fuel tanks. Even if it could theoretically carry 7,000 pounds, in reality, half of that's going to be fuel, and you get the idea. But they did repurpose these. And while the Mark 9, I'll just say that, was retired, the T-7 trainer would actually carry on into the 1990s, and in other air forces, this would carry on into the 21st century. Because it was a solid aircraft. And, it was one of the first British jets to come out in the Cold War period. But far from the last. And, this is the day fighter. What about nighttime? Which is, half of the time on Earth. The Gloucester Javelin. An important aircraft in British aviation history, and also Gloucester history. And I'm not putting this one on the stand because this style of stand started with Witty Wings and continued through JC and others is not known to play well with the spinny thing. And I don't want to risk it falling because this is actually a very heavy model, one of the heaviest I own, because it's pretty much entirely metal. And this was a big aircraft to begin with. So, what is this? Well, to put it bluntly, it's the night fighter companion to the Hunter. Yeah, if Hunter is Dayman, this is Nightman. And the request for it really came out at the same time. As early as 46-47, the RAF put out a tender for an all-weather, essentially night fighter. Therefore, it needed to be radar equipped. Therefore, 2-seater. They also wanted it to be able to have at least 2 hours of endurance, 50,000 50,000 feet altitude, and to use advanced weapons, which eventually would turn into guided missiles. But so this is actually our first missile carrier, or at least it would become so. And the 2 companies tapped for this around 1948-49 were de Havilland and Gloucester, so makers of the first jets for the RAF. And eventually the de Havilland just wouldn't go anywhere. Gloucester would be selected in 1952, and an initial order would be placed for at least 200. But going back just a minute, they had several prototypes. Again, this is kind of the interwar period, so several different designs were trialed out. And the first prototype would fly in 1951, so right on the heels of the Hunter. But even after it was selected and even given the name Javelin, even the designation FAW Mark 1, Fighter All-Weather Mark 1, FAW-1 Javelin, it had problems. Several prototypes did fly. I think they made a total of 5 prototypes. They even had lost one in a crash in 53. The first combat loaded one would fly that year. By 54, they'd worked out most of the initial kinks, and the first production model flew about mid-year, and it did start to go into RAF service, officially being adopted in 1956. And squadrons would transition over through about 59, and this let them finally retire the old Meteor, especially the Night Fighter variant, but in general, that's when the Meteors were out of RAF service once the Javelin came in. The thing is, the two I'm going to show you, we've got a wide range of variants here in a very, very short period of time. But first, the aircraft. This is a big one, about 57 feet long, 52-foot wingspan, 2 engines, initially non-afterburning. These are also a variant of the Siddeley Sapphire, so one of the two used in the Hunter. From the beginning, it had a radar. The only version that didn't was the trainer. And maximum speed right under the Hunters. It was maybe 5 miles per hour slower than the Hunter at altitude. It had a maximum altitude slightly more than the Hunter, just because it was kind of part of the requirements, about 52,000 feet. It had better range and endurance than the Hunter initially, but it would need fuel tanks. In fact, one of the changes they made early on, even before it was put into production as the FAW-1, was they added these bulges called Sabrinas, which are basically permanent fuel tanks. Later, they would go to a wet wing system to give more internal fuel, because we had a big wing here. Some might say the biggest wing in the West. So we did get the F1 available, and their first stationing outside of the UK were 2 squadrons in West Germany. They would also station them in Cyprus and Singapore and a couple other locales. Quite a few squadrons over the years would fly these, about a dozen and a half over different times. But yeah, ranging just from 54 to 58, we have a total of 9 different variants and marks, because they did keep changing up the design. As I have it here with nothing on it, the initial version really was only armed with 4 30mm cannon. That plus a radar, of course your backseater's your radar operator. But that wasn't ever the idea. By this era, they know that guided missiles are on the horizon. So here I have it with 2 heat-seeking, for the time, long-range missiles and 2 fuel tanks. This would give it a pretty good operational ability, and actually this was really when it really met the original Air Ministry specifications once it had its missiles. Still had its cannon. Originally these would be Blue Jay missiles, but very quickly they were changed to the de Havilland Skyflash. Again, early heat seekers, and these would start to be put on board around 1958-59. So about the same time as the AIM-9 would appear and get into combat. So yeah, what about those variants? And what about this plane's combat record? You know, I may be blind, but never let it be said that I don't have damn good reflexes. I was going to show you this next Javelin on the stand. I knew not to spin it on the spinny thing, but because of its weight, it spun itself, and I thought, that's not going to stay. And just as it did, it went off the stand, and I caught the damn plane in midair. Not even a missile fell off. Whew, that had me sweating. Yeah, one of these is from Whitty, and then one is from Aviation 72. Honestly, I forget which is which, because they use the same tooling. One is an FAW4, one's a 9. So what are the differences? Well, the original Mark 1 was really just for trials and testing and training. They built 40 plus prototypes, but it couldn't mount air-to-air missiles. It didn't have all the storage tanks, all the fuel tanks. Therefore, it really wasn't operationally ready yet. The Mark II was actually built with an American-made Westinghouse radar, and it had an updated radome for easier maintenance. Anyone who's ever worked with the electrics on a British automobile can imagine what difficulty level it was before. They also went to a new powered surface tail. They would have those vortex generators at one point. The Mark III was the trainer. It actually wouldn't appear until 1958. The 2 was in 55. The trainer was the same two-seater, but it lacked the radar, a few other little differences. The 4 was 1956, and it was kind of the first one that was at least nominally operationally ready. It could at least mount 2 missiles, and it had some other little improvements to aerodynamics. The Mark V introduced the wing fuel tanks, and the Mark VI introduced those tanks to the updated wing to the American radar system, kind of combining things. And then the Mark VII was really the first one that was truly operationally ready. It would be built in relatively big numbers, over 140, although most of them would be put directly into storage because the plans were to go to the new Mark VIII standard, which appeared 1957, 1958, which was kind of all the final things. Where it really jumped up with the Mark VIII is they had reheat, or at least limited ability reheat, Sapphire engines. They also changed the leading edge of the wing to give it more of a droop. And they carried up to 4 missiles. Often they would remove 2 out of the 4 30mm cannons at this point. And so the Mark IX were actually Mark VIIs updated to the Mark VIII standard. Yeah. So even though they only built like 40 or 50 Mark VIIIs, they would update over 100 Mark VIIs to Mark IX, meaning, effectively they had about 150 in service of the standard. The last new airframe would fly away August of 1960, and that's important because that was the last aircraft that Gloucester produced. They built many of the Javelins, but Armstrong would build others. And the conversion process from 7 to 9 would take place with the last of those aircraft coming out in December of 1961. And that would get the fleet up and rolling. Like I said, they'd be in West Germany, Singapore, Cyprus, and of course UK itself. So how did it do? Well, it flew around a lot, took a bunch of gas. It was one of the first to have air-to-air missiles. It was also in some ways one of the last big night fighter types. But it never saw combat. It came close a time or two, but never did. And it really never saw foreign service that I can think of. They built about 430, 440 counting prototypes. So much smaller numbers than the rest, but this is a very specific purpose aircraft. A nighttime / all-weather interceptor. And of course it needed to operate from quite big airfields. And the radar was quite convoluted with the technology of the 1950s. And its service life, like I said, some squadrons weren't converted over until 1959. The last Mark IX conversions weren't done until the end of 61. And already by 1964, the squadrons in the UK with Javelins saw those replaced out. West Germany would last a couple of years longer. Those 2 squads would be handing in their javelins in '66. And finally, Singapore would be the last bastion for this fighter, which actually happens a lot in British service, with those javelins not handed in until 1968. Still, yeah, you got to consider some of those airplanes were not even a decade old. It's not so much the plane's fault, although they did have some shortcomings that never could be overcome. It was that era. It was a transonic or subsonic aircraft firing first-generation missiles with the old-style large radar set. And it was that period of rapid change. You see it with the MiG-19 didn't last long. In America, the F-100 Super Sabre didn't have a real long life. It's just the progress of technology. Aviation, since before World War II, was marching ahead at just a phenomenally quick pace. So that's why today the Javelin is, I guess we could say, a little forgotten. That's a bit of a shame, because it is a neat aircraft. And this is a really cool model, even if it is a Whitty's/Aviation 72, because it does have gear up or down, removable ordnance. It does have opening canopy with pilot figures. It's probably some of the best work they did. And again, it's all metal. Even the nose, even the wing. The only real plastic on it is the belly tank and the missiles themselves. This one has the engine nozzles for the afterburner, kind of neat. It's got the little vortex generators, and it's got the bumps on the wings. So there are some differences between this and this, although they are quite small. But then again, most of that was just upgrade and what have you. We're not quite done with this era, this series, yes. We've got a day fighter, we've got a night fighter. What about a fast fighter? So we come to the English Electric Lightning, one of the most famous and truly English aircraft of all time, and the first and really only ever purely English designed Mach 2 capable interceptor / fighter. And much like with the ones we just looked at, I'm not going to put these on the stand. This is a Corgi. These old stands, they're kind of a rubber material on top, and they get wiggly over time. And when I have it on a shelf, that's okay. Spinny thing, not so safe. So, oh well. This is an early version. And an interesting story. And this really does date back to the same era. 1947, Air Ministry. When they're outlining what they need for the future, one of the things is they want a supersonic aircraft. And so English Electric quickly proposes what will eventually be known as the P-1, which was a Mach 1.5 capable aircraft. That was pretty crazy for 1949-1950. So much so that they actually tasked Short Brothers to develop a variable wing alternative, which didn't work out. But much to some in the government's amazement, the English Electric design did. The original P-1 was quite capable, and it led to the P-1B, which was a advanced prototype or even pre-production model. Now this would be contracted for in 1952, and in August of 1954 would first fly. And it would do quite well. In fact, on the third test flight, it would go supersonic past Mach 1. But what's impressive is it did it with no afterburner, meaning that technically it was capable of super cruise, if just barely, still quite impressive. So this would lead to further refinements in testing and pre-production models, 1955-56. There's a lot to be worked out here, even if the initial test flights are doing well. It's a very complicated machine. And so it wouldn't actually go into RAF service until right before Christmas of 1959, and even then they actually received 3 P-1B pre-production models. They wouldn't get their first F-1 true production models until early 1960, but then they would begin converting over quite quickly. Now this is an interesting story. It almost didn't make it. In 1957, the infamous white paper came out, after the cuts after World War II, and then the Korean War reversed that, and then there was another reversal, cutting back many military projects. And for a while, it looked like this advanced interceptor might be canceled in favor of surface-to-air missiles, SAM missiles, and other type things. It was spared, though. Unfortunately, other projects for them were not. So it did go ahead. That said, it was always kind of considered to be a bit of an interim measure. I have to wonder, too, if they didn't just do it because they wanted to see if they could. It's a very unique aircraft, starting with its vertically stacked engines. These are the same Avion engines that we've talked about before. Different variant, but there we go. And we do have a Delta wing, quite high swept. Cockpit with one, of course. Overall length is about 55 feet. Wingspan, relatively stubby, at about 35 feet. And the first versions, the F1, F2, were only capable of reaching about Mach 1.7 in their combat loading. And the very first versions were just armed with 30mm cannon, but soon these missiles will be installed. These are the same as we saw on the Javelin. This is the de Havilland Fire Streak. I think earlier I might have said Sky Streak, so apologies. And eventually the cannon would be removed. These, in some theories, could carry other things, but in reality, that's about it. The earliest versions may not have had radar, but this would be introduced by the F3 variant, along with the bigger fuel tank. It had quite an impressive altitude of about 55,000 feet, although it could quote-unquote zoom up to about 70,000 for short durations, hitting the afterburners. And yeah, originally it didn't have a lot of fuel. In fact, originally the F1 wasn't even capable of an aerial refueling probe. The F1A would get one, though. During the final stages of pre-production, they would add a bit of a belly tank here, bulgy tank, to give some more fuel. Neat thing about this model, there's a panel you can remove to look at the engine. The panel's metal, the engine's metal. Pretty much everything on this is metal. It's really quite impressive. It's one of the better corgis out there. So yeah, squadron started converting over, first in the UK, then they were sent to West Germany. So 62, 63, you see more and more coming into service. And then, yeah, you do see improved versions. The F2 had a few quality of life improvements. It actually was designed for low altitude performance. It had variable afterburners instead of just fixed. But really the big jump forward here would be with the F3, which was the highest performance version they made. With the F3, we do have some major improvements. The engines get an upgrade. The radar, we get new red top missiles, replacing the old Fire Streak. We would get the aerial refueling probe, as you see here. They would redesign the tail. They would also kind of redesign the bottom, giving these strakes on the bottom. The F3A would get a bigger fuel tank, bigger belly. for more range. The initial versions only had a range of about 150 miles, but that was okay because that was the idea. These are meant to be stationed near air bases or other sensitive areas to act as bomber interceptors. That's why they only had really 2 offensive weapons, the missiles. Zoom up quick, fast, they had really good climb. They were designed to be able to be scrambled very quickly on very short notice, get up there, get altitude. That's why they could zoom so high, deliver their payload, and that's it. It was going to be a short mission one way or the other. With the F-3, we finally can do Mach 2 in a service aircraft, not just a test aircraft. And like I said, we have improved missiles, better heat seekers, and several other just little quality of life for the pilots. The T4 would be a 2-seat trainer for the F1, F2, and the T5 would be a 2-seat trainer for the F3 and the later F6, which was the final production version. The F6 took the F3 and gave it the ability to mount 2 ferry tanks over the wings. These weren't for combat, they were just to get it from point A to point B, traveling around the world. And when it was meant for combat station, they would be offloaded because the drag was just way too much. And some of the later aircraft would get back their 30mm cannon and a few other little dealy whoppers. There were even some efforts to turn this more into a fighter or even fighter bomber, but not terribly successful. This was designed for a very specific purpose. And yeah. These would start replacing Javelins, including in Singapore. The first Lightnings would go over in 1967. That's why the Singapore Javelins retired in 1968. But despite its really great performance and the way pilots really loved to fly it, ground crews rather hated it because it's British engineering at its finest, for better or worse. It's a complicated machine. And so it was quite hard to work on. And, well, a lot of things had short lives. You can read all about it. Flying them was an interesting thing. It's really the old school. Oh yeah, we do have a cone in the front, not dissimilar to like a MiG-21. A little variable cone, shot cone. Now the idea was they were planning on replacing these in the early 70s. But they didn't have enough of the replacements because another plane was late in coming. We'll get to that in a minute. In the end, most Lightnings, especially the older ones, were retired by 1976, 1977, but 2 squadrons were left flying. And they wouldn't actually turn theirs in until 1988. You got a couple of life extensions for various reasons and various other planes not coming online. And I think because they wanted to. And at the end, 87, 88, the pilots did what any of us would. The airframes that still had life left on them, hours left on them, they blew them to their limits. They did air shows, they did tests, they did some tricks. They pretty much ran them into the ground. They ran them till the wheels fell off because why not? Of course, production had long since ended, so they were using what parts they could. They were swapping out airframes for the ones actually in service to keep them going. They didn't build all that many, under 340, including the prototypes, so even fewer than the Javelin. But for a plane that probably wouldn't have served for 10 years in the beginning, the fact that it served for almost 30 and became kind of iconic for the UK, it's quite important. But unfortunately, we are kind of drawing to the end of an era of truly English designed, tested, built, and flown aircraft. But we still have one more left. One that's really just as famous as the Lightning. The Hawker Siddeley Harrier. And notice that Hawker and Siddeley joined. Soon they would actually join British Aerospace, which is kind of a sign of the times by the 1960s and into the 70s. And this is from Corgi. It's an older one. It's actually very hard to find a original generation Harrier in 1/72 scale diecast, but this is a pretty neat one, and it's a very interesting little aircraft. And it actually dates back to the late 1950s when NATO was looking for a new lightweight attack strike aircraft that could operate from forward bases, provide close support, operate from shitty runways, frankly, in the event of war. And that was kind of what originally inspired Hawker Siddeley. And then they got interested in VTOL and VSTOL, vertical takeoff or short takeoff and landing. And the British government expressed interest in 1960, and the U.S. government said, hey, we might be in for that in 1961. It was a new technology, and they had some very early proof of concept, prototype type things, not even really production, trying out. But this would lead to the Kestrel, the Hawker Siddeley Kestrel in 1964. They would build a handful of those, 10, 12 total, all considered prototype or pre-production, but they used a new engine, the Pegasus number 5 engine as it happens, and this was the variable thrust engine that would allow for the short takeoff and landing or even vertical takeoff and landing abilities if really needed. So in 1965, the design is coming along quite nicely, and the British government is about ready to say, hey, we'll take at least 60 as a new strike aircraft, and the U.S. is still quite interested, especially with Vietnam kicking off. Unfortunately, NATO decided, okay, they want the aircraft to be supersonic, which kind of negates any VSTOL technology of the 1960s. Frankly, it wasn't until very recently this limit has been overcome. So that kind of put NATO out of it. So it's just the US and the UK going. In 1966, work begins on the first prototype of what will be known as the Harrier eventually. And it's basically an all-new design from the Kestrel, although it uses the Pegasus engine, but it is an improved version known as the number 6, the Mark 6 engine. And it will test fly in 1966, showing off its performance and getting everyone pretty darn excited. So an order is placed, and essentially after some prototype deliveries for testing in 1968, the first ones are delivered to the RAF New Year's Day 1969. Training begins because this is a wholly new aircraft, and in October of that year the first squadron is formed, and one of its first overseas deployment is they put 2 squads in West Germany. Later that would be up to 3 because tensions with Russia would ramp up. But yeah, this was meant to be stationed close to the front lines to provide closer support, strike, attack, and also reconnaissance, hence the original name of GR1, Ground Attack Reconnaissance. Interesting that the F is not there, fighter. So what is their first generation of Harrier? Overall length is about 46, 47 feet, depending on the exact variant. And the wingspan, without anything on the outboard, is about 25.5 feet. So it's not a tiny aircraft, but it's not very big either. 1 seat, at least for the combat version, and it is a very cramped cockpit. Pilots also said it was very noisy, and due to the humpback and high wing, there was no rear visibility as such. The wing itself is kind of a modular design, and it was designed for ground attack, subsonic flight. The original Pegasus engine would actually give way with the GR1A, to the, I believe it was the number 10. And with the GR3, we would go to the number 11. I'm just mentioning that because the top speed on certain versions would get up to 730 miles per hour. So right on the edge. In fact, it could go supersonic in a dive. Had a decent maximum altitude of over 50,000 feet. And it had 4 hard points, 2 under each wing, 1 center line. It could also carry 2 gun pods, each with 100 rounds. Cannons there. In theory, it could lift up to 5,000 pounds, but in practice, about 4,000, 4,500 was the maximum, and really, some of that needed to be at least 2 fuel tanks to get anywhere. So really, we had the 2 outboard hard points for equipment. It could carry a pod, at least later versions. It could also carry the AIM-9 Sidewinder, although you don't often see this with the GR1 or GR3. Rather, you usually see it with rocket pods or just dumb bombs, iron bombs. That's why I just put a couple of generic bombs on this one. That plus the guns would give it some close air support, but really it was there as a bit of flying artillery and kind of eyes in the sky. Very analog. Of course, this is before computers, so controlling it was challenging, to say the least. And the tail would move. Of course, the 4 lift jets would pivot. It's a lot to keep track of. And we have the small outboard rigger wheels and then the inner wheels there. And the GR1 would switch over to the GR1A quite early with the new engine and a few small updates to the avionics. Some of the older GR1s would be updated to the new A standard. And then we would get the GR3 in the 70s. During this video, I've been trying to show you at least 2 examples of each type. Unfortunately, like I said, for the first generation of Harriers, it's hard to find models. So here's one. This is a AV-8C in NASA livery from Corgi. Later style, gear up and down. Basically the same, just a repaint, but it has moving gear. So I thought we'd just show it. Why not? The GR3 was a pretty good update. It went to yet a better, more powerful engine, but it had some pretty good updates to the laser designator, laser finding system. It also had a better early warning radar system. Not that it had a radar, I said that wrong, but you know what I mean. Early warning system for radars pinging it. And a few other quality of life updates. And it could use some recce pods and things like that. Slight expansion to its weapons carriageability, but it's still, dumb weapons for the most part. Even with the new engine, you have a little more range, a little more loiter time, but you still can't carry a lot if you want to either hang in the sky for a long time on patrol, which, in a close air support role, you want someone in the air if you could. Or if you left it heavy off, you couldn't go very far. But I wanted to bring this out anyway because the U.S. was always interested in, between 1971 and 1976, British Aerospace, as it would become, would deliver 110 first-generation Harriers to the U.S., mostly going to the Marines. There was talk about it being built in America, but the number wasn't large enough to justify it, so they just were built in the UK. So the U.S. did fly English planes for quite some time. Most were the single seat, but they did get 8 two-seaters. The the T4 was the single seat I screwed that up. The T2 is the equivalent to the 1, and the T4 is the equivalent to the 3. I've been talking for a while now. Sorry about that. Anyway, so after the American run, that's pretty much the end of production. In the U.S. service, they're known as AV-8As. The AV-8C here was an update. kind of analogous, and one would assume that they would have been built to the GR3 standard based on when most of them were made. But again, most of the changes are internal, like the better engine, better performance. And they would serve throughout the 80s. In fact, in England, unlike the Lightning and the Javelin, the Harrier would see combat. In 1982, these would be used to provide close air support. During the Falklands War, 10 GR3s were actually modified to work from the decks of British carriers as well. So you see some, I guess you call it cross-decking. But, yeah, mostly providing the ground strike ability. Again, they could mount the AIM-9 Sidewinder, but I don't know how often that happened. That was about their only offensive air-to-air weapon, again, for the RAF's GR3 version. A lot of the GR3s were updated from the older GR1, GR1As, just as the GR1As were often updated from the GR1. In total, including the batch to the USA, only about 280 were built. So yet smaller numbers, but they got a lot of service out of them. They were getting smaller production numbers, but they were being smarter about it. But with the old analog controls and the Pegasus engine of the time with the limited abilities and fuel and thrust, everyone knew the limitations, but it had a lot of benefits. And to be fair, the Harrier was really the first, and some might say only, successful first-generation VTOL aircraft. A lot of other nations tried. The Yak-38 from Russia comes to mind, but that technically went into service, but it wasn't really a success. This did better than most, and it actually served in combat, but the Falklands would be the high water mark, at least for this version. And would lead to bigger and better things, and it would lead to an era of cooperation and combining resources. Again, budget cuts and just the changing times and the changing economics, but also new pressures from the Cold War kind of demanded it. So let's move right along into a new era. Well, since the U.S. bought some British jets, it's only fair that Britain returned the favor, and we kind of come to that time in history where every one of the Allies started flying McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom. You know, another reason I like doing these videos is it gets a chance for me to get these off the shelf and dust them. Oh well. This is a Phantom from the RAF. This is an FGR-3, aka a F4J UK. Talks began way back in the late 50s, as at the time known as the F4H was just coming around, and the US offered it to the UK. They were interested. This is after the white paper. There was consolidation. This is when you have the aircraft corporations. You have BAC, British Aerospace Company Corporation, whatever, and Hawker Siddeley forming is two conglomerates to cut costs. And basically the push is for the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force to adopt the same aircraft, but they do have different needs. There's actually another round of white papers that further cuts costs, including canceling carriers and ultimately canceling the refurbishment of HMS Eagle. I believe it was Eagle. I think Ark Royal was completed, which kind of doomed the Navy's large carrier fleet, even though it took a few years. For the RAF's part, like I said, the Lightning was an interim measure, and the Hunter was reaching the end of its life even as a ground attack role. So that's kind of what they were looking for. So two versions were created, the F4K for the Navy and the F4M for the RAF, and they were pretty different. The overall length was a little different engine, Same basic performance, but a little different. The Royal Navy only ended up operating about 30 and giving their excess. They were going to order like 100, and then they cut that down. They ended up ordering 50. They didn't actually need the final 20, so the FGR-1, which was the naval version, would end up going to the RAF. The FGR-2, the Royal Air Force version, the 1 would first fly in 66, the 2 in 67, and then they would enter service 68 and 69 concurrent, in those eras. And squadrons would start to form. And the first ones were actually strike squadrons, attack squadrons that allowed them to retire hunters. We talked about the FGA-9. So that was the first one. The Royal Navy would only operate theirs till 1978, when the last large carrier was mothballed, and so they would give the remaining 18 serviceable FGR-1s to the Royal Air Force. The Air Force, for their part, had originally ordered 150. They canceled the last 32, so they themselves got 118. Now, using it for its ground attack ability is great, but they really were hoping for the Jaguar, which was delayed in coming. But once it finally started to appear, that let them switch over to replacing the Lightning and starting to use their Phantoms in the interceptor fighter role around 1974, 75, 76, in that time period. That's when you see the drawing down of most Lightning units. So in the 80s, that's primarily what it was used for. It was, in fact, from about 76 to 86, it was the RAF's primary fighter interceptor. They had another interim solution, sure. But, and the armament was pretty much the same. This is a big plane. It is, of course, capable of Mach 2.2. It can carry up to 18,000 pounds. Lots of hard points. Has the AIM-9 Sidewinder. The U.S. version, of course, has the AIM-7 Sparrow. The British version carried the Skyflash missile instead. A little different. Very similar, but a little bit different. Is a medium to long range. And since these were based on the F4J, or rather the F4J was kind of best on these, there's no internal cannon. That's why we have a cannon pod under this one. I could put the fuel tanks on. I just kind of have it in a little bit more of a clean mode for fun. So where did the FGR-3 come from? Well, first off, in 1982, the RAF sends a contingent of FGR-2s to the Falklands to monitor the air and be there. That meant that there were not enough left in the UK for needs. And since the next air supremacy or fighter interceptor was taking a long time to come to fruition, they approached the USA and they would acquire 15 low flight hour former U.S. Navy F4Js. The U.S. would refurbish them, rework them, give them some UK equipment, calling them the F4J UK, and that's where the RAF called them the FGR-3, Mark III. And they would be delivered 1983, 1984, in that time period, and see service for a few years. But it was, these were already used aircraft, so they had limited hours. And so the 3s were retired in January of 1991, which was kind of interesting because it was right when the Gulf War was going on. The FGR-2s were kept in service a bit longer. They actually sent about 6 to work with the Gulf War contingent of allies, the coalition forces. And they were planning to keep their Phantoms in service a bit longer, but post-Cold War budget cuts would force them to draw them down at the end of 1992. First, the 1s would be taken out, and then the 2s. So they did actually serve for quite a long time, over 2 decades. much longer than the Sabre we talked about, but they were built in the U.S., although they did have some British equipment and weapons. This one here from Hobbymaster is just pretty much a standard F4J, although it does have different accessories, and it does have the British paint scheme. I've had it for a long time. I just think it's kind of neat. Kind of have a thing for Phantoms. Definitely power over aerodynamics. This thing has the flight characteristics of an unaerodynamic brick. Not just a regular brick, but a one without So yeah, we can talk more about Phantoms in another video, but it served the UK long enough. Like I said, first in West Germany, also at home in the UK. And even the 3 here served an important role in the 80s at the end of the Cold War, so I thought it was worth picking up. What do you think? With that, let's go back to Europe. This is where things become international, more so than we've already seen. The Supercut Jaguar. And we're going to mostly be looking at Corgi models for a bit. And there's a lot to talk about here. In the early mid-60s, France and the UK were talking, and then they both needed a new, inexpensive jet. The UK needed primarily a supersonic trainer jet aircraft with maybe a attack ability secondary, which is all useful in training anyway. France, on the other hand, needed a subsonic aircraft, but with more of a strike capability, definitely a attack capability. They thought they could share the workload and develop something, and so in 1965 a memorandum of understanding was signed, and soon thereafter the Supercut company was formed specifically to make this aircraft. It basically was BAC out of the UK, British Aerospace. We already talked about what Hawker Siddeley was doing with the Harrier. This is what BAC was doing. And the French company Breguet. And they would kind of iron out what they needed and go back and forth. It changed a lot. For one thing, France thought they needed a version that was carrier capable. And in the UK needed supersonic, but it was thinking more trainer. It almost looks like it would fall apart. Nevertheless, the first prototype would fly in 1968. It was actually the 2-seat version. A good, dependable aircraft for what it was, and it was ready for production in 1970. Breguet would be replaced in France by Dassault, and after trying to convince him to say buy a Mirage or something, plans to go ahead with what would be adopted as the Jaguar. France would purchase 200, and the UK would purchase 203. Basically, the breakdown was 160 single-seat and 40 two-seat for France, and 165 single-seat and 38 two-seat for the UK. So very similar numbers. There would also be some export customers, and with their orders, it would push production to just over 540. And France would get this into service first in 1973, and the UK would be just a short time later in 1974, as we kind of mentioned on the Phantom section. And it would be adopted as the Jaguar GR1. And this model is of an early version with very standard dumb bombs on the wings. Actually, this aircraft isn't much larger than the Harrier. It's about 55 feet long, wingspan of just under 29 feet, and it is supersonic. It can go Mach 1.6 at altitude. Not bad for what it is. And it can actually cross the sound barrier at sea level, edging out about Mach 1.1. Max altitude is nothing special, but it doesn't need to be for what this is. This is a low-level terrain following aircraft, so about 46,000 feet. But even though it's small, it has a pretty respectable payload of about 10,000 pounds. Has a total of 7 hardpoints, but realistically only 4 to 5 are useful. We'll get to that in just a second. It has 2 30mm cannon built in, although the 2-seat version I believe just has 1. And from the get-go, this was designed, for low-level strike missions. To come in and go behind enemy lines. One reason this really worked out was France kind of dropped the idea of making this a naval-capable aircraft. But another reason really had to do with the USA, the failure of the F-111B project. That was to be Britain's next big strike aircraft, and thanks to the white paper back in '66 and problems with the F-111 aardvark anyway, the B model for the UK was cancelled. Interestingly, the C model would definitely go to the Australian Air Force, making it quite famous. So they lost their strike aircraft. That's why they were using those F-4 Phantoms or FGR Phantoms for a while as de facto strike aircraft in the early 70s. But with the arrival of the Jaguar, they had something. This let them transition the Phantom to the jet interceptor role. And up to 8 squads would operate this in the UK. 4 of them would actually be nuclear capable. These could deliver 1 large guided nuclear weapon or 2 smaller freefall tactical weapons. It could also carry regular dumb bombs, rocket pods, but it actually could launch laser-guided, TV-guided munitions as well. This is kind of the first for that. It also had a secondary reconnaissance role built in, hence the R in the name. So from the get-go, there was always 1 recce squad being fielded of these. And they would be stationed close to the front lines, at least as close as possible, because short airfield takeoff and landing was always a priority. It's not a Harrier, it's not a V-stall. I like how the tail moves on this as part of it. But it could take off from a relatively short strip. It had 2 engines for just dependability. The French version had the Mark 101 engine, but since the Brits were a little bit later getting into service, they benefited from the upgraded Mark 102, had a better afterburner. In the early 80s, this was replaced in the fleet by the 104. These are still the GR1, like this aircraft here. It was a pretty simple, dependable, solid aircraft, kind of using transitional technology. It had terrain following, radar, and what have you, early laser systems, early warning radar systems. But it was a single seat, so you didn't have a radar officer. And it really had no air-to-air fighter capability. It was a strike aircraft. And France would actually deploy theirs quite early on into various African engagements, but the UK, even though they would station them in West Germany and elsewhere in Europe, they really didn't see combat. That is until, well, the 1991 Gulf War, Desert Storm. So we can talk about one of my favorite pink aircraft from Operation Granby. This is the Jaguar GR-1A. The A was actually a consolidation of several updates throughout the 80s. The avionics were updated, the defensive systems, early warning systems were updated, the inertial system was definitely updated, the terrain following system, the cockpit had some updates. Nothing super crazy, but good stuff. And one of the very final things they did in 1990 was add the over-the-wing rails to carry 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders. These were kind of rather hastily put into place before these were sent to the Gulf. So it had some way to defend itself. It always could mount 2 AIM-9s on each outboard underwing pylon, but of course doing so it took up a lot of space. So it wasn't really efficient. This was a way to use the space there and not really impact its carriage ability. The concept actually started with the export model, and it had magic missiles on top. Interestingly, France, I don't believe, ever did this for theirs. But another thing is we have this tandem bomb arrangement. I believe these are 750-pound bombs, and it has clusters here. One in front, one in back. Kind of impressive that the hardpoint can carry that efficiently. We also have pods on the sides. Now this was not capable of laser designating for itself. That's actually why the old Buccaneers were brought out, the old bombers, to do laser designation. 12 British Jaguars operated and actually hit quite a few targets in the Gulf War. They also worked alongside the Tornado, which we'll get to shortly, which was delayed, surprise, surprise, that actually gave this extended life. In fact, the idea was to retire the Jaguar after the Gulf War. They'd already been scaled back. Beginning in 1984, several squadrons had transitioned from Jaguars to Tornadoes, and from a high point strength of 8 squads, they were down to 3 before the Gulf War, so that they would go ahead and kind of retire those out afterwards. But the Jaguar proved dependable, reliable. It was available for service, maintenance. Maintenance hours were good. So, with its success and the fact that they still had several, they'd been updating the GR1s to GR1A standard. I believe they updated about 75 of the older aircraft to the newer standard. They decided to go ahead and just keep these in service. Why not? In fact, let's retire the Buccaneer and keep this around. So it actually flew side by side with the Tornado, and they found that while the Tornado was more sophisticated, had better cockpits, just more modern stuff, it was more complicated. It broke down more often and just had more quirks and things. This was just a dependable, solid aircraft, old school technology, good, solid third generation jet. So yeah, they would keep them in service. Actually, after the Gulf War, there would kind of be a pilot program known as the GR1B. About a dozen would be updated with the laser targeting pods from the old Buccaneers and have other avionic updates. And these would be used over the former Yugoslavia, leading, of course, to the events, Bosnia, Kosovo, all that. And since they were so successful, we would actually get a major update program beginning in 1996. But yeah, I just really like this one here from Corgi. Seeing one all loaded up in that rather unique paint scheme that they did from the war. Pretty neat, since most of the Corgi Jaguars are relatively stripped down. But anyway, yeah, let's move on to the GR3s. So here it is. I thought about putting ordnance on it, but I thought I'd leave it in more of the stripped down mode, just for something different. Now, there were no new airframes. In fact, the last ones were delivered in 1981, right as the new Mark 104 engines were coming out. So we're refurbishing and repairing. As far as the Mark II fighter jet, strike fighter I should say, that was the trainer, the T2 trainer. And there would be a T2A with the same updates that the GR1A had. But yeah, they're in Operation Deliberate Force. The GR1Bs with targeting pods would work with Harriers to hit targets. And that led to the 96 plan, which would be known as the GR3. The idea was to kind of incrementally update. The GR3 update had the usual stuff, avionics, some new displays, compatibility, basically just making the laser pod designator a standard. And these started to be delivered in 1997. But really, it was just a stepping stone for the next step there. So that I bring this one to hand again. I had to have everything out anyway, so why not? This is a neat one. Just a interim here. Not a lot of external differences from what we've looked at. Next one's a little more interesting though. First known as the 97 plan for the year, this would be known as the GR3A. And it has further updates to the avionics, better, more modern data link system. It has a modern cockpit with newer displays. It actually has night vision goggle compatibility for the first time. And in 1999, the newest and latest and last engine update, the Mark 106, would appear for this version. And they would also have increased compatibility with ECM pods, reconnaissance pods, designator pods, things of that nature. And the first updated aircraft to this standard would be delivered in the year 2000. And to be fair, this was kind of the end now. It's already nearly a decade after the Gulf War, but it did prove itself over the former Yugoslavia and all that, working successfully. The only reason that really this probably was kept around as long as it was, well, the next generation of fighters, not the Tornadoes, but of course the Typhoons, the Eurofighters, were taking longer than expected, so they're making do with the Supercat Jaguar. Now, they did plan to put these into combat on the quote-unquote War on Terror. In 2003, there were plans to station these in Turkey and fly them to support operations in Iraq, but the Turkish government objected, so the plan was just shit-canned. It was just canceled. And that was kind of it for this aircraft. They would putter around a bit. The ones that were still going, the new standard was working well for what it was, but you can only update a 1960s era strike aircraft so much, especially one that started off as a trainer. So in 2004, they announced they would retire these at the end of 2007. Now, France would actually retire their Jaguar fleet first in 2005. They had sent some to the Gulf War in 1991 too, by the way. And because of changing budgets and needs, the UK would actually push up the retirement of the Jaguar slightly to April of 2007. And so this one from Corgi here is pretty much the last flight. It has the fuel tanks, pretty standard kit. This actually did decent on internal fuel, pretty efficient engines compared. But with the two external tanks, have this more in a recon support role with the pods on top and then sidewinders on the underwing for self-defense. Again, at this point, these airframes were well over 20 years old, some of them 30 years old, so yeah, you can understand. Good plane though, easy enough to work on, but the GR3A standard was about as modern as you could get. They did update about a dozen of the T2 trainers to the newer standards, and these were known as the T4, but small fry. So after 2007, the venerable Jaguar, that started off as a trainer and is kind of the second choice, the backup plan if the F-111 didn't work out, which good they had it, because this would be the primary strike aircraft throughout the last 2 decades of the Cold War for the UK, and serve in the 90s pretty actively. And if it hadn't been for politics, it probably would have served in the second Iraqi war. But, oh well. Now, we've mentioned the Panavia Tornado. It has a very similar and very different story and is very concurrent to this plane. And it's going to be a pretty long section because there's a lot to get into there. Well, best started. Some military historians, Cold War historians, call this the most important European jet of the 80s, 90s. The Brits just call it the Tonka. The Panavia Tornado, a joint project. And we're back to Hobby Master here. A couple of years ago, they started doing these. Corgi had done them for years at 1/72 scale. And this is an early GR1. And that's why I thought it was neat. And this goes all the way back to the 1960s. Really right on the heels, working alongside the whole Jaguar thing, there was the Anglo-French variable geometry wing project or program, another joint fighter, the AFVG. Talks began in 65, but France pulled out in 67. And then, the F-11B was canceled, F-11K if you prefer, in 1968. And that left the UK without a strike aircraft. Now, the Jaguar would be great as a small little, dependable, but it wasn't a high-performance thing, multi-role thing. So Britain was looking for new partners after the whole 66 white paper thing, budget cuts, everything, for a new thing. Well, on the other side, several nations were looking to retire the aging Lockheed F-104 starfighter. This would include West Germany, Canada, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, who had all operated it. So Britain approached them, and the idea for a multi-role fighter was born. It would be a strike aircraft first and foremost, attack aircraft secondary, fighter interceptor secondary role, even a reconnaissance and electronic warfare aircraft. With maybe small variations in either loadout or kit, depending, but basically the same thing. So in 1969, the Panavia Company was established in Germany, and West Germany, Italy, and the UK signed a letter of intent and agreement. At this time, Belgium was swayed by France to kind of leave and join them. They ended up ultimately buying what would become the Mirage 2000. Canada would hang in a bit longer, but they decided, you know what, this is going to be a European-style fighter for European needs. Also, the European politics were starting to drive them a little crazy. They're across the pond. It just didn't seem like a good fit for Canada. So they would go their own way. And the Netherlands would hang in for a little bit longer, but eventually they realized that this was going to be too much of a advanced, complicated aircraft for their needs. So they would drop out 70, 71. And therefore, around 72, 73, orders were placed. For example, Germany ordered about 320. And there would be a work share program set up. Germany and the UK would be equal at 42.5%. And Italy would take the smaller slice at about 15%. And this would lead to the idea of, does it need to be a single seat, like the Jaguar, at least the strike version, or a two-seater? So quickly they decided twin seat. That was kind of the name of the game. You can't help but see some familiarity with the F-14 Tomcat. And therefore, work began on the first prototype, which took to the skies in August of 1974. And the test pilot said it was remarkably nice. It did really well. The first prototype flown for the UK would be in October of that year. And really not a whole lot needed doing. But budget and politics would get in the way. It wouldn't be until 1976 that orders were formally placed with the factory. And this would lead to the first production models in 1979. They would test fly then. Then the first training school would be established in the UK in 1981. West German, Italian pilots would go there to train as well, kind of centralizing resources. And then in 1982, at the beginning of the year, the first production GR-1s would be delivered, and the first squadron would begin to transition. And they would switch over that summer, beginning to fly the new Tornado. And in 1983, two more squadrons would switch over. And this is why in 84 we're seeing some Jaguars switching out and everything. The Tornado is able to come into the strike role. Now, Britain did not purchase the electronic version. This here is sometimes called the Tornado IDS. Like I said, they called it the GR-1. It was capable of carrying nuclear weapons, but was mostly meant for conventional ordnance. And the RAF version here was meant for air-to-ground The Germans also had a maritime version, anti-shipping, and the British could carry such missiles as well. This is not a huge aircraft. Overall length is roughly 56 feet. The wings could sweep from 25 to 67 degrees, meaning they were between about 45 and 29-foot wingspan. The whole idea with variable geometry, wings fully deployed straight out, gave good landing and takeoff performance, fuel efficiency, maneuverability, but swept back gave speed and the ability to dash in just kind of hot rod mode. And of course in between. Now originally it was manually adjusted. Now, like I said, there's a crew of 2, pilot and weapons/radar operator. Radar was standard. It had a terrain following system, more advanced than the Jaguars. More advanced stores systems. In fact, it was the first aircraft of this type to really have a digital data bus. So kind of getting into newer computing technology. Twin engine. It is capable of Mach 2.2. And it's actually able to lift a little bit more than the Phantom at just under 20,000 pounds, fully laden. And it has 2 27mm, they're made in Germany, cannon. And we have 2 hard points under each wing. And they do pivot as the wings move. Not on the model, unfortunately. Actually mounting things on the wings for both the Hobbymaster and the Corgi give me fits. They're annoying. But they're more for fuel tanks. It can carry up to 4. And it can also carry a couple of air-to-air defensive missiles, like the AIM-9 initially. But its main payload is on the underside. There are 3 hard points with extended racks considered heavy duty. This one has 4 standard bombs on it. That's how it came from Hobbymaster. It can carry quite a bit of weight under its belly there. And quite a wide payload. Pretty much anything you could think of. Because that was kind of the idea. This was a pretty advanced aircraft for its day and time. But because it needed to have pretty good short field takeoff and landing performance, its size and weight was kept reasonable. Its maximum altitude wasn't anything insane, but it could get well over 50,000 feet, depending on the variant. So, sufficient, higher than the Jaguar. But again, it's a low altitude strike aircraft. So yeah, deliveries would continue. Italy, well, I should say West Germany would get theirs just after the UK in 1979 starting. Italy would first get theirs in 1981, going from there. So they would all start switching over in the mid-80s. Production would continue all the way till 1998, but the bulk was done in the first few years. In fact, the 500th airplane out of about 990 was delivered in 1987, so that tells you something about the production rate. And they did well. They would, there's not a whole lot negative to say. I mean, it's interesting that a multi-role aircraft designed by committee, literally, turned out as well as it did. And France backed out, of course, and that led to the Mirage 2000 and the Rafale. And this also kind of paved the way for future joint cooperation projects. And while it served in the 80s, its first big combat debut would come in 1991, you guessed it, with the Gulf War. And now we come to our first Corgi Tornado, and this is from Operation Granby, 1991, with that brown paint that turned pleasantly pink in the desert sun and heat and wear. So, there had been a few minor updates, but basically the same aircraft in 1991. Again, it worked alongside the Jaguar. Even some old Buccaneers were pulled out. 60 of these would be used there. I believe around 6 were lost to accidents and enemy fire and whatnot. So while no Jaguars were lost in Iraq, they did lose a few of these. And it really taught them lessons, and they did well. Like I said, they weren't as available as the Jaguar, but they had better targeting, more precision, much better cockpit, better avionics. Of course, they were much faster. But they gave the Brits ideas as to what to do next. This one has 2 large bombs underneath, and I was able to get the fuel tanks with the AIM-9s on the wings of these. I was hoping when Hobby Master did theirs, they'd make a really clever way to attach things to the wings, but I don't know why it's so difficult. But it is. They just kind of keep wanting to do just like a socket, like a round peg, and like, oh, that won't fall out. Yeah, I think maybe like coming from the top and like making a 2-piece thing where you put a piece in the top, that way it's basically screwed in would be better, and it can still rotate. Oh well. Anyway, one thing I will say is the wings pivot on both, of course, but the tail plane does move on the Corgi. And does not on the Hobby Master. But at any rate, so all the way back in 84, they were thinking about what would be the midlife update. And so in 94, they got serious. Now, we did have a couple of variants. There was the GR1A, which was a reconnaissance variant. And there was the GR1B, which were about 2 dozen that were given anti-shipping missiles, Seahawks, I believe. I think they had their radars slightly changed for more maritime operations. But those are just small variants. But the beginnings of the GR4 would be in 1994. They would work on exactly what they were going to do. And in 1996, they started kind of rotating aircraft in and out, sending them back for updates and upgrades. And the process would last until about 2003, with the final ones delivered back to the RAF. The RAF had originally purchased 228 Tornadoes. Now they would upgrade 142 to the new standard. The big difference was, originally, this was meant to be a low-altitude, terrain-following strike aircraft. But with new anti-aircraft systems and electronics and avionics, its mission was shifted to medium altitude. Just the better operational parameters, with better guided munitions, they could still hit their targets and be much safer. So they would upgrade systems accordingly. The avionics would get updates. We get new sat-nav stuff, introduction of GPS, introduction of the ability to use night vision goggles in the cockpit, introduction to use newer versions of the paveway, that kind of thing. And yeah, like I said, they were delivered up until 2003 and were a pretty good step forward. Even with production of new airframes over, they would have these in time for the second Iraq War. And unlike the Jaguar, the Tornado would definitely get to see action quite a bit for a very long time, actually. So let's swap this one out for a newer model. So here we have another Corgi. This is a GR4, much more modern. There would also be a GR4A reconnaissance variant. This is a combat variant because these saw service in the Second Gulf War beginning in 2003 all the way up to 2009. And this one has a targeting pod for more precision strikes. On the other side we have 2 guided bombs, and then we have Little cluster back there. Are those brimstones? Look like little brimstones in the back rear, but maybe not. One thing I can say is it has the Azeron, the AIM 132 instead of the AIM 9. I believe that one was an AIM 9L. Instead of going with the AIM 9X, the current one that the US uses, they did the Azeron, and it's kind of neat that it's on this next to the fuel tank. So yeah, you can definitely tell. And of course, these continue to have avionic updates, defensive suite updates, more and more updates to the cockpit, a digital heads-up display, helmet compatibility, that kind of thing. And they were operating from higher altitudes now, but also dropping weapons that could be more precisely targeted from a further distance, therefore at least keeping them safe from like man-portable things, shoulder-fired things, and even it's just more time, of course, for electronics, countermeasures, and other protection to take effect. The data bus, the data links were updated, communications systems, coordinations, all the stuff you'd expect. And these would operate in Iraq until the summer of 2009, and they would be pulled out. Now, there was a discussion who to retire in 2010. For a long time, they thought they would keep the Tornado around until at least 2025, especially with the GR4. But then, because of budgets and changing priorities, in 2010, someone was getting the axe, the Tornado or the Harrier. For a while, it looked like it might be the Tornado. Turned out it would be the Harrier. Therefore, as the Harriers were rotated out of Afghanistan, some squads were actually replaced with these, with the Panavia. So they would start operating in Afghanistan for a number of years, I believe up until like 2014. They would also be used delivering precision guided weapons in 2011 in Libya. We've talked about that whole operation a lot with the French video. And in 2018, there was a couple of notable events with the Tornado operating around in Syria, and they even helped deliver cruise missiles. But by this point, their days are numbered. They're scheduled to be drawn down. Already by 2016, 2017, there's only 2 squads still operating these, because finally their replacements, the 2 of them, are starting to become available. And at the beginning of 2019, these would fly their last combat missions that January. And you would have some final flights in March, and then they would be officially retired from the RAF April 1st, 2019. So basically, 40 years after the first production model flew, or almost, just a couple of months shy, frankly. Not bad. And they had quite a fleet of these. And the GR4 update, along with the GR4A reconnaissance, did a good job. Like I said, the British wouldn't pick up the electronic version, the ECR. They would modify some of these to be Wild Weasels or Seed Roll aircraft, but they were still the IDS variant, as you see here. But even though they didn't adopt the electronic warfare variant, they did adopt a unique interceptor variant. So we're not done with Tornadoes yet. Nope, not at all. The Panavia Tornado ADV, Air Defense variant. This is still pretty standard with the standard version. It's about 80% parts commonality, but there are some major differences. In the late 60s, the RAF was still wanting a new advanced, long-range, high-endurance interceptor for bombers. And they tried to get other participants, Italy, West Germany, involved. But no, they wanted a multi-role aircraft, like we've already seen. So in the end, around 1969, 76, the Brits just decided to go it alone and authorized their own version of the Tornado. And its first test flight would be a few months after the first production model IDS would fly, so relatively late 79. And they would ultimately pick up, well, I should say Pan Navy ultimately would build 218 of these. The only real customer besides the UK was Saudi Arabia, and UK would get about 165. Italy would actually end up getting some on Lend-Lease because, say it with me, the replacement for what they were hoping for didn't come along. So they needed a stopgap. But anyway, back to the UK. They started working with this. The first version, known as F2, notice with the IDS we jumped from GR1 to GR4. That's because F2 was taken up by the air defense variant here. That was the first production, well, that is production model, I guess, pre-production, what do you want to say? The reason I say that, they only made 18 F2s in 1984 and 1985, and the F2 was almost the same as the IDS. It had the same engines, and it actually lacked the radar because it wasn't quite ready yet. They were not ever operational. They were made for training, testing, and then they were just put into storage for just in case. 1985, towards the end of the year, the F3 would first fly, and then the first squadron would be operational with these by 1987. And it is a different bird in a lot of ways. Whereas the GR1 was designed for low altitude and the GR4 for medium, from the get-go, the F3 was designed for high altitude performance endurance. It's a little longer, about 5 feet longer, so about 61 feet. Wing spread's the same. It does have more wing positions and more automatic positioning from the computers. The computer systems themselves are more advanced. The engines are uprated for high altitude performance. The wings themselves can be swept back further for dashes. And whereas the GR1 and 4 carried air-to-ground ordnance, the ADV wasn't cleared for that. It carried air-to-air pretty much exclusively. Under the fuselage, we would have 4 medium to long-range AMRAAM-type missiles. The original version carried 4 Skyflash, which was the British version of the Sparrow, the AIM-7. This only has 2 under it because on the stand it's really hard to get the other back 2 in. And it can carry up to 4 fuel tanks for ferry mode, but really in combat mode it can carry 2. One difference, instead of having 1 short-range missile on the tank pylon, now this has 2, so it carries basically 4 medium-range missiles and 4 short-range. This one still has the AIM-9. Again, I think it was the L, whichever version was cleared for export. So, yeah, standard load was 8 air-to-air missiles. Now, this wasn't a dogfighter. This was not an air superiority fighter. This was a bomber interceptor. It had the same top speed of Mach 2.2, same altitude of roughly 50,000 feet, but it was much more comfortable up there. It had good endurance, too. Part of the extra length was for the new, much more powerful and more advanced radar system. Another part was for additional fuel, and one of the 27mm cannons was removed to make room for an aerial refueling probe. So on its own fuel, it had a flight duration of 2 hours. Not bad. It could, do patrols or long-range escorts, or again, bomber intercepts thanks to its radar. And having a crew of 2 really helped. Kind of a neat variant. Again, it's the air-to-air variant. And they would send some of these, I think it was 18, over to Saudi Arabia in 1990. And then in 91 during the Gulf War, they would fly combat patrol and escort protect missions, and they would remain around for 1992, enforcing the no-fly zone. Then they would also send some down to the Falklands, relieving some older aircraft, and so on and so forth. I really like this variant. I don't know why, just do. And then in 1996, when they've been in service for roughly a decade, production would run up to about 93, so all the airframes have at least a couple of years on them at this point. They look to basically a midlife upgrade and update program. So basically around the same time as the GR4 program got going. And here we have a modernized, updated variant. Still call it an F3. There'd be one round of updates in 96, another round in 2001. This would have more advanced radar systems put in for multi-target tracking and even firing weapons. Of course, they would refurbish the airframes, what have you, improve the cockpit displays, stuff you'd usually think of. And the weapons carriage would be updated. The AIM-9s would be replaced with the AIM-132, the ASROM. Again, it has 4, 2 under each wing. And the Sky Flashes would be replaced with the AIM-120. So a newer missile there as well. So most of the changes were to accommodate those new weapons systems. And just, general updates to the design. Now the ADV would be deployed to the second Gulf War, second Iraq War, 2003. Of course, they have no ground strike ability, so they were there sweeping the skies for any enemy aircraft, MiGs or what have you. But they got bored and went home. Yeah, they flew around for a bit, but there was just nothing for them to do, so they were sent back home. And at this point, the days are numbered. There actually still are a few more updates happening up to about 2005, 2006. But now we've drawn down to just 12 active. Just one squadron flying the F3. Because finally, its replacement, or rather one of them, is available. As I said a minute ago, Italy would actually borrow a couple of batches in the 1990s to fill the gap. And since the gap ended up lasting even longer than they thought, they ended up getting some F-16s from America. It's kind of funny. But at the end of the day, by 2010, they knew that it was time to retire these. The stresses of high altitude performance and whatnot, and the fact that it's just a more limited role. There just weren't many interdiction missions, intercept missions for them at that time. Not in Afghanistan, not in Iraq, and that was the wars being fought. So in early 2011, the Tornado ADV F3 was retired from service. Again, Germany never used these, but then again, like I said, Britain never used the electronic reconnaissance version, so hey. This was their own special version, though. I think it's kind of cool for that. And I like having an example of early and an example of late outfit. The airplanes themselves externally don't change much, but the weapons loadout do. And these are actually my first Corgi Tornadoes. So yeah, now you might be thinking at this point it's time to talk about its replacement. And you're almost right, but we have one more stop off to make before we can get to that. So, with no further ado, let's kind of get into the home stretch of this video. Before we can move forward into the 21st century, we have to go back, and we have to revisit the Hawker Siddeley Harrier. Although now, the manufacturer is BAE Systems and McDonnell Douglas. This is the Harrier II, known in the USA and for the U.S. Marines as the AV-8B. Going back to the 1970s, Hawker Siddeley and McDonnell Douglas, who had handled the AV-8As in America and the AV-8C updates, wanted to produce a better, more capable jump jet under the Pegasus 15 engine program. But there was a bunch of stuff. The British government backed out around 73, 74, even if, like I said, the company in England was game. And then when the Marines tried to go it alone with McDonnell Douglas, the Carter administration only agreed, under the Carter administration, only agreed to fund it because under the Navy procurement if they had a foreign buyer, foreign partner. So instead of being more or less equal partners, the Harrier that started off in the UK, now the British are a junior partner. They took a look at the AV-8B prototype in 1981 and generally liked what they saw. But they wanted a few changes to make it a little more maneuverable, a little more agile, and just to suit British equipment. And so they agreed to fund that, plus some other stuff. They would do assembly, and they would purchase at least 60 aircraft. So first, the AV-8B would test fly and then go into service 83, 84. And after that, they would begin working on the improved GR3, which would take its first flight in 1985. And this would become known as the GR5 in 1987 when the first production models were delivered, and the first squadron would re-equip at the end of 1989 and then be deployed kind of as a field testing to what was changing from West Germany to Germany in 1990 briefly. Now it's worth pointing out that the GR5 was not put into the first Gulf War because it was just too new, so it would have to wait. And this is a GR5 on the spinny thing. How is it different? How is it better? Maybe. How is it worse? This was designed to have more payload and or more endurance, and to be more comfortable, more intuitive for the pilot, and easier to fly. But we're still not to the point of advanced computers and all that yet, so you're still having to fly the V-stall aircraft. Overall length is a little over 46 feet. Wingspan is about 29 feet, 30 feet, depending on exactly. So it's a bigger wing, about 15% bigger wing than the original. It's a modular unit. We do have an upgraded Pegasus engine, more oomph. Because of that and the bigger wing, we go from 2 hard points under each wing to 3. Plus we have 2 under the fuselage. Whereas the original could lift up to 5,000 pounds, 4,500 really, max for practical reasons. This could lift up to 8,000 pounds. So, yeah, good increase there. Had about the same max altitude of about 50,000 feet, although it was slower. Some versions of the GR1, GR3 could get up to 730 miles per hour. This would top out at about 670, again, kind of depending on the variant. So it was 60, 70 miles slower, but the trade-off was better fuel efficiency and just more usefulness. So that was the GR5. It, unlike the U.S. Marine version, it actually had 2 25mm cannon pods that could be attached under the fuselage, although rarely was this done. No radar, originally no night vision compatibility. And there'd be the GR5, about 40 of those were built, and then they would build 20 GR5As. The only real difference was these were meant for upgrade because they knew something was coming along better because I'd already tested it. Right as the GR5 was starting to go into service, the GR7 would take its first test flight, and then the first of those would be delivered in 1990, and by 1991 they were active. They would actually deliver enough of the Harrier 2s that by 1994 the RAF was able to retire their older first generation Harriers, GR3s, GR3As from service. And while they didn't serve in the first Gulf War, they were deployed in 1992-93 to enforce the no-fly zone around Iraq. They were also put on a mission to defend the Kurds from retaliation from Saddam Hussein. And then we would roll around to the war over former Yugoslavia, leading into Bosnia and Kosovo. But by that time, the GR7 was supplanting the GR5. Most of the GR5s built were updated, nearly all of them, to the GR7 standard. So with that, let's switch out what's on the spinny thing. Whereas Corgi did the GR1, GR3s and the initial Sea Harriers, Hobbymaster is kind of the go-to in 1/72 scale for the Harrier 2 series. The first one was a Hobbymaster. They only did 2 GR5s. There's a 1990 West German/German interceptor version, and then there's the one you just looked at, which is the test scheme version. This is actually a very recent release on Hobbymaster. It's a GR7. It's in a winter camo scheme from Operations in, I believe, Norway. What's interesting about it is it does have the 2 cannon pods underneath. I've seen the U.S. Marines have the models have the cannon pods as an option, but this is the first British one I picked up that has it. One thing to note that the Hobbymasters have that the Corgis don't is the horizontals do move on this. This one's stiff because it's new, but the tail does move. The downside to the Hobbymaster design is with the Corgi, when you rotate the 4 exhaust vents from the Pegasus engine, you rotate one, all 4 move. Hobbymaster, they're independently, you have to move all of them. The Corgi one's kind of cool, but sure, whatever. You'll notice more accoutrement on the nose. This had more warning software, electronic countermeasures, comms arrays, ability to interact with guided munitions. The GR7 would be the first to have night vision compatibility for the cockpit. The overall cockpit was really improved. It still has pretty crummy rear visibility, but it's better. It sits up higher. It's more of a bubble canopy, giving more of a field of view for the pilot. It's a little less cramped compared to the original, and just, more modern instrumentation. And of course, it's updated to use newer missiles. This one has some Mavericks on it. They would be cleared in 1998 to use laser designator pods. Some years later, they would be cleared to use sniper pods, but the problem was, even though they could use them, the RAF never had enough for their needs. So it was kind of like they had to compete to see who got the pods. But as I said earlier, the Jaguar in operations in Bosnia would designate for the Harriers, and so they could deliver guided munitions, various versions of the Paveway. Now, in 1994, a GR7 made the first landing on board a carrier, British carrier, and that led to kind of an exercise deployment test run in 1998 with the RAF GR7s stationed on board Royal Navy carrier, which will become important later. Again, they would serve in Kosovo, 1999, and they were there to provide close air support. They had better loiter time than the original Harrier, better payload. They could come in, they could operate from a forward base. They also served a reconnaissance, eyes in the sky role, and they could use newer pods for that as well. Just all around an improvement. Not a quantum leap forward, but taking a good design and just polishing it up. And again, you had McDonnell Douglas and BAE Systems working together on this, jointly building them for the U.S. Marine Corps, the Royal Air Force, and what have you. And we would start to see these in 2003, Iraq, and they would first go in 2004 into Afghanistan to relieve U.S. Marines AV-8B pluses. Their sister ship, really. There are differences, but they're slight, mostly just for the individual air forces that they flew in. There would be some new build GR7s, I think around 3 dozen, but most of the fleet would be rebuilt from the GR5s, which, to be fair, were not very old at that point, so makes perfect sense. So with that, like I said, this is a neat one. It actually came with quite a few weapons. Got some guided bombs and Mavericks on it, fuel tanks, and then the gun pods. But being from 2004, it doesn't have all the updates these would get. So with that, let's swap it out for a combat version and talk more about the service history. So here we have a GR7 done up. Service Afghanistan 2006-2007. I believe it's out of Kandahar Airport. Going back just a bit though, in Kosovo, a dozen of these actually did quite well, hitting targets, and that would continue in the Second Iraq War. They would use Maverick missiles, which were quite new to the British Harrier, to take down Iraqi Scuds. I remember in '91 watching it on TV. Yeah, those were problematic, so I understand why they were a target. They would also hit convoys, trucks, other things, maybe even light structures. And they would support advancing troops, just, providing them cover with rockets and anti-tank weapons. And like I said, they would also go to Afghanistan, appearing there. In 2005, there would be some losses. 2 would be damaged, 1 destroyed outright, and another one was able to be repaired. This wasn't shot down, they were just damaged on the ground during an attack on a base. And their hottest year was 2006. They were used a lot, and this was mostly in the close air support role on troops in the ground, and they used rocket pods mostly at this point. And they would be cleared the next year to use the sniper pod, targeting pod. I should say there was also the GR7A, which were 30, given an upgraded Pegasus engine. It's kind of interesting, there was a 7 and a 7A. I have to think that the A's were meant for kind of hot and dry, higher altitude operations in Afghanistan. It wasn't a new standard, it was just a variation with a more powerful engine. Yeah. And the idea at this time was that the Harrier would serve in the Royal Air Force up to at least 2018. So they looked into ways to, further push them forward. They'd already updated the avionics with the GR7. We had better ECM, better new computers, updated computers were put in them, better comms arrays. Communication is obviously very important with a close air support aircraft. They continue to expand the weapons payload abilities. And they're doing well. New built aircraft are over though. And then, in 2006, the Royal Navy retires the venerable Sea Harrier, which we'll get to in the next video. But it's probably my favorite Harrier variant. It might have seemed like an early retirement, I would agree. Budget cuts, yeah. Plus, they thought that the F-35 was just around the corner. That didn't prove true. So the Royal Navy is effectively without a fighter or strike aircraft to operate off of its carriers. But remember, back in the 90s, they tested it out in 94 with a 7, and in 98 there was a cruise that went to the Persian Gulf with Royal Air Force GR-7s on Royal Navy carriers. Well, now this Joint Harrier Force thing comes to be in 2006. And because we have GR-7s, GR-7As, some updated for pods, some not, various things here and there, this is confusing. We need a new standard. And so we come to the final British Harrier. In the latter half of 2006, the new GR-9 standard first flew, and the first aircraft were delivered to the Royal Air Force at the beginning of 2007, and they would first be put in theater in Afghanistan early that summer. I think it was in June. Now, these were not newly built airframes. These were updated GR-7s and GR-7As. They selected 60 good airframes, saying low mileage, no damage, and those were to be updated to the GR-9 standard. This is basically just kind of polishing off, making sure they had the latest night vision compatibility, latest computer systems, all that stuff. And these were to be operated by the RAF from land bases, but also they would operate on detachment on Royal Naval carriers. So the Royal Navy would actually operate the Royal Air Force's Harrier because they retired their Sea Harriers. Because that makes sense. And they would continue to have operations in Afghanistan up through 2009. And they actually were expanding it to take more weapons. For example, the Brimstone missile, which is an air-to-surface missile. Think of the American Hellfire, but updated a bit, more powerful. Little anti-tank, anti-armor missile. They carry a bunch of them. They also were cleared to carry the AIM-132 ASRAAM, like we saw on the aircraft. So an updated off-bore sight, short-range, lightweight, air-to-air defensive missile. They were cleared to take all the newer pods. So it was quite clear they're planning on keeping these in service for a while. In the Royal Navy until the F-35 was finally ready, and in the Royal Air Force, like I said, up to at least 2018. Because plans are moving forward. And then politics got in the way. Like I said earlier, it came down to the Harrier or the Tornado. One of the programs was being canceled. And even though it looked like it would be the Tornado first, it ended up being the Harrier. So in 2009, later on in Afghanistan, the Harriers are pulled from theater there and replaced by the Tornado, which is still operating. And the Royal Navy would continue to operate them through 2010. The last cruise, the last carrier op, would be in November of that year. That would be the last time a Harrier would operate from the deck of a British carrier. And then shortly thereafter, the Royal Navy would retire the GR-9/GR-9A, depending on which engine it had. And the Royal Air Force would continue to fly them a short time more through the spring of 2011, and then retire them as well. And then they would sell off 70 some odd, some of them quite new GR-9s, to the U.S., not for the Marines here to fly, but just to be used for spare parts, basically the boneyard, at a very cheap price, which many British taxpayers were not terribly pleased with. Kind of makes little sense to spend money on an upgrade program just a couple of years later, really after just finishing all the conversions, to scrap them and sell them cheaply, all in the name of budget to save money. Yeah, anyway. I admit the Harrier is getting a little long in the tooth, but it was providing a necessary role in Iraq, Afghanistan, when they're at war, and they already put money in them, so why not? Oh well. This model from Hobbymaster is actually in the final, I guess they call it the disbandment scheme 2009-2010. And it is a GR9, which is kind of neat. They did several of these. This is the best they ever got. There was a 2-seat trainer called the T10. It was combat capable. They didn't have all that many. I think it was around 14. And then they would even do an update to GR9 standard for training called the T12. Again, so they updated 2-seaters for training on these. You know, you might wonder, why didn't they update some of the older GR3s along with the trainers from the old generation? They possibly could have. They looked at it, but they had decided it wasn't economically possible, plus several of the airframes had quite a few hours on them. It just wasn't worth it, as we like to say. The juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. The U.S. Marines came to the same conclusion, updating the AV-8As to AV-8B standard. So I just thought I'd mention that. So they were long out of service too. And really, thus ends one of the last great British inventions when it comes to aviation history. The Harrier, while not perfect, I mean, it really was the only successful V-style aircraft of its time. Even though the Harrier 2 was just as much American, if even more American than, British, it was still distinctly British. You think Harrier, you think British. And the GR9 was the final version, analogous to the AV-8B+, but the loadout's a little different. So what do you think? I like my little Harriers. They're fun. And I can't wait to talk about the Sea Harrier with you on the Royal Naval video. And now we can finally talk about current generation RAF fighter aircraft. And we finally come to it. The Eurofighter, known as the F-2000 in European nations, but known in the UK as the Typhoon. What a story. International cooperation at its finest. It's funny how so many of these programs dating back to the 80s and 90s took so long, came in so behind schedule and so over budget. And in the end, kind of delivered good aircraft. I mean, I already looked at the French Dassault Rafale, and that goes back there to the 70s. Britain and others were needing their next true air superiority fighter. They had done fighter bombers, the Harrier, of course. They did strike aircraft, interdictor, interceptors. But if you notice, there wasn't really a true air superiority fighter. Something to go against, say, the F-15, the MiG-29, the Sukhoi Su-27. You know what I mean? So, yeah, there were lots of programs. I'm not going to mention them all. I will say that in 1979, the first talks between the successor to Messerschmitt, MBB, came out and talked with British Aerospace. They had proposals. France was in, France was out. They were back in 83. This would be the FIFA, F-E-F-A, Future European Fighter program. But it fell apart because France, A, wanted it to be carrier-based, which no one else really needed, and B, wanted a controlling interest at Dassault. So they left, they took their ball and went home, and they more or less took Spain with them. That left the UK, West Germany, and Italy to kind of do their own thing. But it wouldn't be long before Spain left France and went and rejoined them, to which France France actually officially protested. That would lead to a technology demonstrator in 86, around the same time the earliest Rafale-type predecessors would fly. Built in England, this was not a Eurofighter, but it was a tech demonstrator. It would fly for a number of years and basically lead to things. Now, Italy, West Germany, Spain, and England, UK would all sign a committal. Then the Cold War ended. There was a bunch of stuff. In fact, Germany tried to pull out in 1991, but due to contracts really couldn't. So they tried reducing their order. There was a bunch of stuff back and forth. In the interim, 1994, the first actual Eurofighter prototype. The name Eurofighter had been used informally as kind of a nickname since the early 80s, but it became more official. And even a holding company had been established, Eurofighter GmbH, out of Germany, to kind of consolidate and coordinate these. And the plan was each nation would do their own assembly, but each component would be sourced from a single vendor. So that could lead to problems, and it has over time if someone's short. Finally, though, in 96, committals start to be signed. Germany still kind of is a bit of a holdout, but they finally get them on board by late 97. And by 98, official orders were placed, and they decided to purchase these in tranche numbers. Now, that's not really production numbers so much as order blocks. We've had tranche 1, 2, and then there was a tranche 3, but it was the biggest one, so they broke it up into 3A and 3B. Why they didn't just do tranche 4, again, probably more bureaucracy. So, it was put into production, and in 2003, the UK received its first Eurofighters for conversion, training, and evaluation. And the reason I put this one on the spinny thing first, this one's from Corgi. A, this was my first Eurofighter I ever bought. B, it's a two-seater, and the first one that the UK received was also a two-seater, known as the T1. So they would begin working up. They got it at the very end of 2003, so effectively 2004. And it was 4.5, knocking on 5 years behind schedule. But here it is. They would start to deliver the first single-seaters soon thereafter, and then the first squadron begin to kind of ramp up in 2006. Ironically, yeah, we're really right around the same time as the Rafale. Coincidental, I'm sure, but I do find it funny. So dimensions were about 52 feet long, 36 feet wingspan, so it's a medium-sized aircraft, 2 engines, max speed of Mach 2. It's capable of Mach 1.2 at sea level, and it's capable of supercruising at about Mach 1.5. Very standard for the Rafale, Russian planes, American planes. These kind of seem to be the standard. But at this point, they realize going past Mach 2 really has no benefit for a fighter. Maximum altitude is about the best the RAF's ever had at about 65,000 feet. And it can carry nearly 20,000 pounds on a total of 13 hardpoints. But the first Block 1 aircraft are strictly air-to-air. The Block 5 production series would have very, very limited air-to-ground capability. And from there, it would just progress. Block 8, Block 10, Block 15 up to Block 20, each time giving it more of a multi-role capability. Because yes, originally air superiority fighter in the 80s, but obviously by the 21st century, that's of limited utility. Multi-role is the name of the game. You know that. The two-seater here, while it was used for training, it was fully combat capable. In fact, it's the same overall length, they just have a longer canopy. We have moving parts here, which is kind of neat on the Corgi. And there are elements of stealth. This is not a 5th generation stealth aircraft, but they did what they could to minimize the radar signature. Again, much like Dassault. So yeah, they stood up. First squad in 2006. And we go from there. So let's swap this out for the true fighter. Here we have our Hobby Master. These came out more recently than the Corgi. This is the F2, the first fighter variant. Again, the T1 was the trainer. And the F2, essentially, while it might have started off with strictly air-to-air, most of them were given at least very limited air-to-ground early on, or were built from it, from the factory initially. And trainers, 2-seaters that were built or upgraded with some air-to-ground were known as T3 for what it's worth. So yeah, this was the Air Supremacy version, first featured in 2006-2007. And standard combat load for intercept and patrol are 4 medium to long range AIM 120Cs and 4, sometimes 2, but usually 4 short range AIM 132 Azeroms. So pretty standard. We also have one 27mm Mauser cannon, 150 rounds. Of course, aerial refueling. 3 of the 13 hardpoints are wet, meaning fuel tanks for extended range and loiter. Pretty neat on Hobby Master's part. Much like the F4 Phantom and others before, the AIM 120s kind of set in semi-recessed niches in the hull there. And the outboard are typically the lighter. And the wingtips have electronic countermeasures, jamming pods, electronic pods you can see right here. Instead of missiles. That's part of the survivability on the modern battlefield. And the canards give it better agility. They do move on the Hobby Master, but they're a lot stiffer. So unless you work them, at first I didn't even think they moved, but they do. They're just stiff, which isn't a bad thing. But it does add to its takeoff and landing performance, short field performance, and of course, like I said, maneuverability in the air. And we have that Delta Wing form. It does look cool. So I think we continue to see receive Tranche 1 and then Tranche 2s with the F2 standard. But the air-to-ground capabilities weren't as important to Germany, Italy, and Spain. But the RAF, Britain, they were really pushing for it. The war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, there was a need. Now, the fighter variant was good and has actually proven useful in intercepting Russian long-range aircraft over the years. So that's good to have it. And performance, it is hanging in there. Despite the incredibly long development period, it is a good fighter. Like anything, it's had its issues, teething problems. But each successive block coming out of the factory is better. I think we're up to, what, block 20 or block 25 now? Mostly just newer computers, avionics, GPS, the usuals. And in 2008, the next variant was cleared for service in the RAF. Meet the true multi-role version, the FGR-4, the Fighter Ground Attack Reconnaissance Mark IV. Like I said, known in the UK as the Typhoon, known in Germany as the F2000. One of the fun stories that dates back to the 90s when they were trying to pick the official name. Britain suggested Typhoon. Germany, Messerschmitt, or MBB, didn't like that. Too much World War II connotation. So, the UK, trying to be generous and kind, suggested, okay, if you don't like Typhoon, how about Spitfire 2? Typhoon suddenly didn't sound so bad. It's also worth pointing out that the planned future replacement for this in the RAF is known as the Tempest, at least for now. But I do love that story. I could just imagine them. The British sense of humor. It works for me. But yeah, they were pushing for the multi-role version, expanding its ground attack capabilities, also eventually anti-shipping capabilities, which would take longer, and reconnaissance capabilities and electronic warfare, just, all around true multi-role. So you see this one's decked out here. This was actually the very first release from Hobbymaster. It's 2011, the operations in Libya. We talked about how the Rafale operated there. And then the Tornado too. Well, so did the Typhoon. It was really when it was first getting into true operational readiness. But we see 4 relatively big bombs on the wings, 2 short-range ASRAAMs for defense, and then it still has the 4 ARAMs under the belly, just in case. Those seem to be pretty well standard. If it wasn't on the stand, it would also have a targeting pod in the middle here. But unfortunately, because of the stand, you can't slot it in. They do make a stand that fits in the engine, so I might have to pick that up sometime. Just so I have the pod on this. But yeah, this is the version that the RAF wanted. And this let them retire quite a few older aircraft. And it was actually quite combat capable. Again, relatively small plane, fast, high altitude, can carry as much as any other planes, including the Tornado. And it takes advantage of much more modern fly-by-wire computerized systems, so it doesn't need swing wing or any of that stuff. This is the first true fully digital plane. The Panavia did a good job, but yeah, this was it. And we've seen quite a few updates and new sensor systems and whatnot added over time. So you'll see different loadouts, different bulges and antennae here and there. This one over here, by the way, the F2, it's from 2015, so relatively recent. These were used for hitting terrorist camps in Iraq in 2014, and then at the end of 2015, they started hitting terrorist operations in Syria. And the F2s were kept for air defense in the UK, also the Falklands, and then that left the 4s able to go overseas and perform those missions. It was also decided, as the 5th Typhoon Squadron organized in 2015, to go ahead and keep some of the Tranche 2 aircraft, the F2s around as is, and basically the air-to-air role. So 2 more squads could form up to 7, just to have more active. And the idea is they'll keep flying the F2 till about the year 2025, by which time they'll either retire them or update them to the FGR Mark IV standard. But they were given anti-shipping abilities around 2017. They carried out various other operations. A British Typhoon got its first air-to-air kill in 2021 when it shot down a hostile drone. And then in 2022, during an exercise with the USA, one of these armed with an anti-shipping missile hit and sunk a target ship, so displaying its ability to do that. And they continue to update these and fly them in the RAF in various roles. And it has a pretty open architecture, like the Rafael again, so who knows where it'll end up. Again, they're already talking about its replacement, but that's the way of things. I mean, heck, talks on what would become this or went back way back to the 70s. Yeah. But no, this is a neat one from Hobby Master. Politics and all that aside, they did a good job, and it is fully loaded out. And what's kind of neat about this is unlike a lot of planes that are fully chunked out, this one's a realistic load. This would have been a bombing load going to Libya. 4 air to surface, plus ability to escort itself and get back home, and then 2 fuel tanks for extended range. It could take a third one on the center line, but typically that was taken up by the pod instead. So yeah, not trying to shortchange the Eurofighter in this video, but its story isn't complete yet. And it's one of those things, either I cut it short, or this gets way long, and yeah, I think we're good. We're done. Well, we're almost done. We all have to talk about yet another fighter that took way too long and cost way too much. And that leaves everyone asking the question, was it worth it? So, our final member tonight. And we finally come to the Lockheed F-35. Or as it's known in England, Britain, UK, presumably Wales and Scotland too, the Lightning. And they're going with the F-35B variant. This is primarily needed by the Royal Navy to operate off carriers, but the Royal Air Force is using it to replace the Harrier. So while it will be used for air-to-air missions, it's more of a close air support, around the tack type thing. Of course, the F-35 is infamous, famous, whatever. I mean, what can you say? It's meant to have quote-unquote low-cost stealth. It's a 5th generation fighter, that's for sure. It's stealthier than the Typhoon or the Rafael. To date, there's not a 2-seat version, just the single-seater. It's about 51 feet long, with about a 35-foot wingspan, again, kind of depending on the version. Of course, the B that the British are adopting is the V-stall, and it is historically very important because this is the first V-stall capable aircraft that can go supersonic. At altitude, about Mach 1.6, and it can supercruise. It only has 1 engine, although it's an extremely powerful engine. Internal weapons carriage, there's 4 hard points. The B can carry up to 2,000 pounds, 1,000 in each bay. Typically you'll see a medium to long range AIM 120 in there, and then 1 bomb. The wings have 6 more hard points. Typically the tips, if armed, will have short range air-to-air, whereas the American version has the AIM 9X. The British version is going with the AIM 132, the ASRAAM as you would expect. The 2 inner hard points can take pretty much anything you want, and if it can't, they're working on it. For example, the Meteor missile is working on being integrated. The B version doesn't have an internal gun, but it does have a gun pod, 25mm cannon, and the pod itself is even meant to be low-vis stealth. Maximum altitude's about 50,000 feet. So, yeah, it's the Lightning. I mean, we can go into it more, and I probably will when it comes time for the Navy video. As far as the RAF goes, the original 2008 flying of the prototype finally got the B underway. This is the most technically challenging member of the family. In 2013, the first squadron was announced and initial testing and training began, and that would last all the way up to 2018 when the first squadron, the Dam Busters, would get their first production model airplanes, and then they would have their first overseas deployment in 2019 to Cyprus, and they would be declared initial operational readiness, and in June sent out on the first combat missions to seek out, find, destroy terrorist targets in Iraq and Syria. They would also start working with the Queen Elizabeth, HMS Queen Elizabeth, later Prince of Wales. In October, landing on the deck, Royal Navy F-35Bs. They were still working up for their first squad, and sea trials would also start landing. 2020, they would have joint operations, so on and so forth. And by the end of last year, they had roughly 30 in service with the RAF, so enough for 2 squadrons plus reserves for training and testing. And this story is presumably just starting because the UK has announced this will be their frontline fighter for about 3 decades. So definitely into the 2040s. And for what these cost, yeah. Although, the development costs a lot. It'll be interesting to see what actual production runs into with these. Of course, a lot of other nations are going with the F-35. Israel, Japan. Its future is unknown. But it is serving the RAF. Since the premature retiring of the Harrier, they haven't really had a V-style capable craft, which is just kind of a shame for the people that invented. So what do you think? Are you in the hate it or love it camp for the Lightning? Let me know. And with that, we are finally ready to wrap this thing up. And here we are, back where we started. I'm not sure how long this video will end up being. I haven't downloaded the files yet, but I promise you, however long it was for you to watch it, and I presume you're watching it in chunks, it was longer for me to make it. In fact, it was my entire day. I think I'm at about 16 hours and counting. Of course, I took breaks, did other things, did laundry, but I need to get these down in dust, and it's kind of nice to revisit models you haven't had your hands on in a while. It's almost like having new things again. I forgot how heavy the Javelins were. I don't know, there's something about British aircraft, and I have these kind of arranged with the essentially British designs on top, the ones that were designed in-house, from the Meteor and Vampire to the Hunter, Javelin, to the Lightning, to the Harrier. And then we come down here and we start seeing joint projects. The Jaguar, the 2 Tornadoes, of course the Eurofighter, another Harrier, and another Lightning. Funny how that works. And this is pretty much all their frontline fighters, interceptors, ground attack aircraft. There were a few others, and throughout this video I tried to toss some in, like the Phantom and the Sabre. A few others they used. Training aircraft. I could have, brought out some of the trainers, but this was long enough, I do believe. The Hawker Hawk's a neat trainer, though. I almost put it in, because it's so iconic. But then where do you draw the line? So what's your favorite? I think the design, there's a certain style to them. I'm a sucker for a delta wing. If you couldn't tell, though, the Harrier is a sneaking favorite of mine. But I'm also kind of a big fan of the little Jaguar. I often gets overlooked, but it's a very good little thing for what it was. I don't know. Corgi's done a really neat job bringing us British jets that no one else has. Hobbymaster is starting to break into him a little bit with the Tornado and the Eurofighter Typhoon. And of course they do the Harrier 2s. So they're doing the newer. But when it comes to the older jets, like the Meteor, the Vampire, we're really lucky to have Corgi. And it's kind of funny that the one they never really did, the Javelin, Whitty did. And it's one of the best Whitties they ever did. Not perfect as a model, but put a lot more effort. That had to have been a passion project by someone that just wanted to see it happen. I've got this one GR1. I'd like to find a GR3 armed up one day. But frankly, I'm just happy to have a GR1. It took a long time to find it. And I've got that NASA one too, which I really actually enjoy. And I actually really do like the new Harrier from Hobbymaster. For this kind of overall layout, I picked my favorite of each variant. I showed you most of what I have in this video. There's a couple I didn't bring off the shelf, like another Meteor. I have a Meteor F3, and I've got an F8, but they look so similar to this I didn't think it would matter. Showed you both my Lightnings, both my Javelins, pretty much all my Harriers. All but a couple of my Jaguars. I've got a 2-seater. But again, I didn't want to bring trainers into the mix. Yep. But yeah, the F1 Meteor I picked just because of it's cool. This actually I got for Christmas a few years ago. It came in a set with a V1 Buzz Bomb, and I'd wanted that set for a long time, and I just found it in the store, and it was really neat. The Vampire, I bought it when these were still out, but I bought it right at the end of the release, so if I'd waited a few more weeks, it probably would have been sold out. The Hunter, I've got a handful of these. They're neat. I wish I could find an FGA 9 that has armament on it. But all the ones I've seen, they just have the tanks and that's it. And there's not even pylons or a way to attach that I can see. Not easily. The Javelins, I'm just glad someone did them. Such a weird, obscure aircraft. And a very heavy model. The Lightnings, I'm really happy to have two. The one that's here, I've had for a long time. The Mark 1 you saw, I actually picked up a couple years ago. Aikens had found one in the back hiding out. It was around Christmas and I couldn't say no to it. I wouldn't mind getting one that has the fuel tanks on it, but I just never have seen one. And now prices on these old Corgis are just way too high. Corgis are great, but they're a $60, $70 model, maybe $100 for a big one. More than that, it's just not a good value. But for what they are, for their price, they're great. Same thing goes for this GR1. Obviously, that's the only one I really have, so it was be the one I was going to pick. It has the gear in the down position. A little bit of a bummer, but it's also kind of neat to have one because the gear are kind of fidgety on the removable ones, so that's okay. Moving over here, I had to pick these two for the Jaguar and the original Tornado. The Operation Granby is just too neat. The Gulf War was the war that was happening when I was a old little kid or young big kid. And so, yeah, plus I just think these are really neat config, especially the Jaguar. There aren't many of the Corgis that have the sidewinders on top, and that's such an iconic part of being a Jaguar. Plus the tandem rack bombs. It's just really neat. But this is neat too with the big paveway bombs on it. And then moving on here, I like the air defense variant. I could pick are, the early versus late config. I just went with the late one because I kind of like the AIM 132. I think it's a neat looking missile. I actually like the wing feature on the Corgi a little better. They're both geared, Hobbymaster and Corgi, but what's kind of neat is when you put the Corgi all the way forward, it has these little fillers that come in the back to kind of fill the hole. The slot little things kind of gear up. On the Hobbymaster, what they expect you to do, and it's fine, you can get little plugs and just put them in for display. You see this with their F-111 aardvarks too. It's a better design as far as durability, simplicity. The Corgi's a little bit fidgety, but it's a neat thing when it works to see it look right. I just wish Hobbymaster and Corgi could get their pylons done better. Like I said, maybe having a two-piece thing where there's a plug that comes from the top that snaps into the bottom so it doesn't fall off, because even if they fit tight in the beginning, if you rotate them enough, they just worm their way out and that plastic wears and there's nothing you can do about it. And you don't want to glue it because you want to pivot it. And when you glue things, they don't move anymore. The Harrier I picked, maybe it's just because it's the newest one, but I actually think the winter camo is neat. It came with a lot of armament, and it's one of the few Harrier 2s I've had that has the gun pods. I've got some of the U.S. Marine ones with the gun pod, but this is the only British one I've ever picked up, and I guess I just like it because I didn't even know it even had the gun pod, so when I unboxed it last year, it was just a neat little surprise. It's finally, Hobbymaster is doing a really good job with the Eurofighter. I picked this one because A, it's the first release, and B, it's all armored up. It's the Libyan operation helping get rid of General Gaddafi. Not a nice man. So, good on them for that. I'm not the biggest fan of American or British imperialism, but sometimes taking out a bad guy's a good thing. So I think this is a neat one. I like the pure fighter variant too. I think in terms of looks, I think it looks cooler. It's sleeker. This just has more historical significance. And finally, the Lightning. I like this fighter. Hobbymaster did a really good job with it. They do the A, the B, the C, and they're starting to do versions in quote-unquote beast mode. So that's kind of neat, where you can hang ordnance off the wings in the B. I had to pick one of those up soon. They've released a couple of new ones from the Prince of Wales, Sea Trials and whatnot. I'll get one sometime. And sorry I didn't go too much into detail with this. For one thing, getting quite tired. For another, there's just not much of a story in the UK yet with this aircraft. Kind of like with the Eurofighter, if we go too much into detail, it'll be a story all on its own. So that's why I picked these. I don't know. I just find the British aircraft attractive, and they have really pushed aviation forward. From the Meteor, and yes, even the Vampire, to the Lightning, to the Harrier. Yeah. They play an important role, and I have much respect for the RAF, the Royal Navy. I'm tired. If I wasn't, I'd start up the recording the Navy video, but that might have to wait a few days because I am pooped. Appreciate you watching this video. Again, I'm sure you did it in sections and chunks. But if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to, go over and support on Patreon. All the same. It's the Mishaco channel Patreon, but, it's just me, so, same thing. But no, I do these because I really just enjoy it. Because I get an urge. I get something out of it. I'm not sure what, but I like creating, and I like sharing, and I like talking, and I like history. And I needed to get these down because they were very, very dusty. So, it's a good chance to dust them off and just do an inspection. Once in a while, it's nice to do it. Recently, did it with the Russian shelf. Now I've done the British. Probably next, after we do the Royal Navy, we'll do American. Kind of feeling a hankering to talk about the Century series. F-100, 101, so on and so forth. What do you think? Let me know. Alrighty, guys. This is Misha, And I'm going to take a rest, and then I'll catch you very soon next time. So overall, this is not a huge aircraft. It's got about a 56 feet overall length. Of course, the variable jeopardy, there we go. I'm going to start this over.